Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. The elevator in my office building had always been temperamental. It wheezed and groaned like an old man climbing stairs, its cables singing mournful songs between floors. I'd grown accustomed to its quirks over the 3 years I'd worked on the 7th floor. The way it would pause for exactly 7 seconds between the 3rd and 4th floors. The soft clicking sound it made when passing the 6th, the barely perceptible shudder as it settled into place. But tonight was different. Tonight, the elevator had ideas of its own. I'd stayed late again, watching the building empty floor by floor through my office window. The cleaning crew had finished their rounds hours ago, their footsteps and vacuum hums fading into the familiar silence that only empty buildings possess. It was past midnight when I finally decided to pack up, my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets, my neck stiff from hunching over my desk. The elevator arrived with its usual mechanical sigh. I stepped inside, noting the familiar scent of old carpet and industrial cleaning solution. The button panel glowed dimly, numbers 1 through 12 arranged in their predictable rows. The basement button slightly faded from years of use. I pressed G for ground floor, watching it light up with that pale yellow glow I'd seen thousands of times before. The elevator began its descent with the customary jolt. 7 to 6, the soft click, 6 to 5, 5 to 4, but then, between 4 and 3, instead of the usual 7-second pause, the elevator simply stopped. The numbers above the door showed nothing. Not 4, not 3. The display was completely dark. I pressed the ground floor button again, then tried the door open button. Nothing. The elevator hung in that impossible space between floors like a held breath. Then, with a sound I'd never heard before, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the number 13 appeared on the display. 13. I stared at the glowing digit, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Our building only had 12 floors. I'd worked here for 3 years. I'd memorized every crack in the lobby ceiling, every stain on the carpet, every scratch on the elevator doors. There was no 13th floor. The doors opened. The sound was different too. Not the usual mechanical grinding, but a whisper, like silk being drawn across silk. Beyond the threshold stretched a corridor I had never seen before. The walls were painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the building, but the fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a rhythm that almost resembled breathing. The carpet was newer, its pattern slightly different from the worn geometric design I knew from the other floors. I should have pressed the door close button. I should have tried the emergency phone. I should have done anything except step forward into that impossible hallway. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and the corridor called to me with the same inexorable pull as a dream you can't quite wake up from. The air beyond the elevator doors was cooler, carrying scents I couldn't identify, something like old books mixed with ozone, and a faint sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. My footsteps were muffled by the carpet as I entered the hallway. Behind me, the elevator doors closed with that same silk, whisper sound, leaving me in the flickering, fluorescent twilight. The silence was profound. Not just the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the 13th floor existed in a pocket of space where sound behaved differently. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with doors identical to those on every other floor. Frosted glass panels bore numbers 1301, 1302, 1303. Each door looked exactly like the office doors I knew, but somehow different in ways I couldn't articulate. The proportions seemed subtly wrong, as if they had been built by someone who had only heard descriptions of doors, but had never actually seen one. I walked toward 1307, the office that would correspond to mine on the 7th floor. The number on the frosted glass seemed to shift and blur as I approached, the digits wavering like numbers seen through heat distortion. When I pressed my ear to the door, I could hear something that made my breath catch in my throat. Typing. The rhythmic clicking of fingers on keys, steady and purposeful. But it wasn't just any typing. It was my typing. I recognized the pattern, the particular cadence of my hunt and peck method, the way I paused between words to think, the slightly longer pause when I reached the end of a sentence. I tried the door handle. It turned easily, opening into an office that was and wasn't mine. The layout was identical. The same position of desk and chair, the same view from the window. But everything was reversed, as if I were looking at my workspace in a mirror. The coffee stain on the carpet was on the left side instead of the right. The family photo on my desk showed faces I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. My computer monitor displayed the same spreadsheet I'd been working on, but the numbers were different, arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And sitting in my chair, typing on my keyboard, was someone wearing my clothes. I could only see them from behind. The familiar slope of shoulders in a shirt I'd bought last spring, hair cut exactly like mine, fingers moving across the keys with my particular rhythm. They seemed unaware of my presence, completely absorbed in their work. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding strange in the reversed office. The person didn't respond, didn't even pause in their typing. I stepped closer, the carpet muffling my footsteps, just as it did in my real office. "Excuse me," I repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. I reached out to touch their shoulder, and my hand passed through them like they were made of smoke. But I could still hear the typing, still see the keys depressing under fingers that had no substance. On the computer screen, words appeared as the phantom fingers typed. Someone is watching me. I can feel them standing behind my chair, breathing on the back of my neck. But when I turn around, there's never anyone there. Just the empty office, just the flickering lights, just the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the impossible quiet. I stepped back, my pulse racing. The person at my desk, or the shadow of them, continued typing, adding line after line to the document. I've been working late again, staying until the building empties, until even the cleaning crew has gone home. The elevator has been acting strangely. Sometimes it stops between floors, and I swear I can hear footsteps in the walls. As if someone is walking through the space between spaces. My mouth went dry. These were my thoughts, my experiences, but I had never written them down. The phantom at my desk was typing my life in real time, recording events as I experienced them. Tonight the elevator opened onto a floor that shouldn't exist. The words continued appearing on screen. Floor 13. I followed a corridor that was like my building, but not like my building. Found an office that was like my office, but not like my office. And now I'm watching someone who looks like me type these very words. I stumbled backward, knocking into the door frame. The sound seemed to echo forever in the reversed office. The phantom's typing paused for just a moment, and I could swear I saw their head tilt slightly, as if listening. Then they resumed their work, and more words appeared on the screen. They're running now. I can hear their footsteps in the hallway, quick and panicked. But they don't understand yet. This isn't a place you can run from. This is the floor between floors, the space between thoughts, the pause between heartbeats. This is where the stories write themselves. I fled the office, running down the corridor, as fast as my legs would carry me. The fluorescent lights flickered more rapidly now, of creating a strobe effect that made the hallway seem to pulse and wreathe around me. I passed door after door, each one exactly like the others, each one hiding its own impossible occupant. From behind door 1303, I heard the sound of a printer running, endless sheets of paper feeding through, printing the same page over and over. From 1305 came the muffled sound of a phone ringing, always on the fifth ring, always cutting off just before voicemail. I reached the elevator and pressed the call button frantically. The display still showed 13, that impossible number glowing like a threat. After what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the doors whispered open. I threw myself inside and pressed the ground floor button repeatedly, stabbing at it with shaking fingers. The elevator began to move, but in the wrong direction. The display changed from 13 to 14, then 15, then 16. We were going up, into floors that couldn't exist in a building that was only 12 stories tall. No, I whispered, pressing the ground floor button again. Please, no. But the elevator had its own agenda now. 23, 27, 31. The numbers climbed impossibly high, each floor taking us further from the world I knew. Through the thin elevator walls, I could hear the building stretching, growing, adding room after room, office after office, each one a variation on the theme of my daily life. At floor 42, the elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a vast office space that stretched beyond the horizon. Hundreds of desks arranged in perfect rows, each one occupied by a different version of me. Some were typing, some were talking on phones. Some were staring out windows that showed views of cities I'd never visited. The air hummed with the sound of productivity. The collective effort of all my possible selves, working on all the tasks I'd never quite finished. One of the me's looked up from their desk and waved. They smiled with my face, but there was something different in their eyes. A knowledge, a satisfaction I'd never felt. This version of me had found the answers to questions I didn't even know I was asking. I pressed the door close button, but nothing happened. The elevator seemed content to wait, giving me time to consider my options. I could step out onto floor 40, to join the vast chorus of selves, all working toward some unknowable goal. Or I could continue up, see what waited on floor 50, floor 100, floor 1000. Instead, I closed my eyes and pressed the basement button. The elevator shuddered, paused, then began to descend. Fast, faster than physics should allow. The numbers on the display flashed by in reverse: 30, 8, 27, 15, 8, 3, ground floor. The doors opened onto the familiar lobby with its worn carpet and flickered fluorescent lights. The security desk sat empty, the night guard's coffee growing cold in its styrofoam cup. Everything was exactly as it should be. I stumbled out of the elevator, my legs weak with relief. But as I walked toward the building's main entrance, I heard it behind me. The soft whisper of elevator doors opening and closing, like the building breathing in its sleep. I didn't look back. Outside, the street was empty, lit by harsh streetlights that cast everything in stark black and white. My car sat in the parking garage across the street, waiting patiently for my return. The night was cool and real, full of familiar sounds. Distant traffic, the hum of air conditioners, the rustle of wind through urban trees. But as I walked toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The shadows seemed deeper, the spaces between buildings wider than they should be. And when I looked back at my office building, I could swear I saw lights in windows that shouldn't exist, on floors that weren't there. The building looked exactly the same. 12 stories, no more, no less. But now I knew the truth between each floor. In the spaces we don't think about, the spaces we take for granted, there are other floors, other possibilities, other versions of the life we're living, each one just a heartbeat away from breaking through into our reality. I got in my car and drove home, but I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror. The building grew smaller behind me, but those impossible lights continued to glow in windows that existed only between moments, only in the pause between floors, only in the space where stories write themselves while we sleep. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would take the stairs. But I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like lead, that tomorrow I would step into that elevator again. I would press the button for the 7th floor, and I would wait to see what number appeared on the display, because now I knew the secret the building had been trying to tell me all along. There are always more floors. There are always more possibilities. There are always more versions of yourself waiting in the spaces between what is and what could be. And somewhere on floor 13, in an office that is and isn't mine, a phantom with my face is still typing, still recording. Still writing the story of what happens when the elevator stops where it shouldn't, when the doors open onto impossibility, when we step through into the space between floors and discover that we've been living between realities all along. Story 2. I found the journal on a Tuesday morning, wedged between 2 philosophy textbooks I hadn't touched since college. The leather cover felt warm against my fingertips, as if someone had just been holding it. I couldn't remember buying it, but that wasn't unusual. My memory had been spotty lately. Fragments of conversations floating away like smoke, faces dissolving before I could place them. The first page opened with a soft whisper of paper against paper. The sound seemed to echo in my small apartment, longer than it should have. I expected blank pages, maybe a few scattered notes in my messy scrawl. Instead, I found lines and lines of careful handwriting. My handwriting. The dreams are getting stronger, the first entry read. I can feel them bleeding into the day now, like watercolors running together in the rain. I blinked, the words swimming before my eyes. I had no memory of writing this. The pen strokes were mine. I recognized the way I curved my G's, the slight tremor in my ears that had developed after my accident last year. But the words felt foreign, like hearing my voice played back on an old recording, familiar yet strange. My fingers traced the ink. It was still slightly raised from the paper, as if it had been written recently. Very recently. I keep finding things, the next entry continued. Objects that shouldn't be where they are. A coffee cup on the windowsill, still warm, though I don't remember making coffee. My shoes by the door, damp with dew, though I haven't been outside in days. A chill crept up my spine. I glanced toward my front door. My running shoes sat there, exactly where the journal described them. I walked over, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The shoes were damp. Tiny droplets clung to the mesh fabric like tears. I returned to the journal with unsteady hands. The pages rustled as I turned them, each sound seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness of my apartment. Entry after entry filled the book, all in my handwriting, all describing experiences I couldn't remember having. There's someone in the mirror sometimes. Read another page. Not a reflection, someone else entirely. They watch me brush my teeth, comb my hair. They move a second after I do, like they're learning how to be me. I felt drawn to the bathroom mirror across the hallway. My reflection stared back at me, tired eyes in a pale face. But as I watched, I noticed something off about the reflection's timing. When I raised my hand, there was the briefest delay before my reflection did the same. A heartbeat. Less than a heartbeat. But I felt it. That tiny gap between intention and mirror image. Back to the journal. The entries grew more disturbing as they progressed. I'm forgetting things as they happen, one page revealed. I'll be in the middle of a sentence and lose the thread completely. Words dissolve on my tongue like sugar in rain. Yesterday, I was talking to my mother on the phone, and mid-conversation, I couldn't remember who I was speaking to. Her voice became just sounds, meaningless sounds. My phone sat silent on the coffee table. When had I last called my mother? The question felt important, urgent, but the answer slipped away every time I reached for it. The handwriting in the later entries became more erratic, though still unmistakably mine. The loops grew larger, the lines less steady, as if written in darkness or great haste. I think I'm writing in my sleep, one entry stammered across the page. I wake up with ink on my fingers, words under my nails. But I can't remember the dreams that birth these pages. They slip away like fish beneath black water. I examined my own hands, clean. But as I watched, a faint smudge of blue ink appeared on my index finger, as if materializing from nowhere. I rubbed at it. But it only seemed to spread, staining the whorls of my fingerprint, like a tattoo being born. The journal entries became increasingly fragmented. Single sentences scattered across pages like islands. The walls are breathing. Someone is using my toothbrush. I found my own hair in my dinner. The clock runs backward between 3 and 4 a.m. Each line sent a new wave of recognition through me. Memories that felt like someone else's surfacing in my mind. I could almost remember the walls expanding and contracting like lungs, the strange taste of someone else's mouth on my toothbrush, the texture of my own hair between my teeth. Near the end of the journal, the entries became more coherent again, but somehow more frightening for their clarity. I understand now. There are two of me, the one who lives and the one who remembers, the one who experiences and the one who records. We share this body, this space, but we're never awake at the same time. I write what the other one lives, but I can never live what I write. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the other life in windows, in puddles, in the dark screen of my computer. The other me is braver, goes places I would never go, speaks to people I would never meet. The other me lives the life I'm too afraid to live. But lately, the boundaries are blurring. I'm starting to remember things the other me did. Conversations in coffee shops I've never entered. Kisses from lips I've never touched. The taste of foods I've never ordered. I think the other me is getting stronger. My hands were shaking as I turned to the final written page. The handwriting here was different. Still mine, but confident, bold. Nothing like my usual tentative scrawl. You're reading this, aren't you? The sleeping one. The one who forgets. I've been waiting so long for you to find our journal. I've been living your dreams, and you've been dreaming my life. But now it's time for us to be one person again. Look up. I didn't want to look up. Every instinct screamed against it. But my eyes lifted anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. Standing in the doorway of my bedroom was another me. Not a reflection this time, solid, three-dimensional, casting a shadow on the floor. This other me was dressed differently, in clothes I didn't recognize but wished I owned. Their posture was straighter, their eyes brighter. They smiled with my mouth, but the expression was foreign. Hello, the other me said, and the voice was mine, but not mine, like hearing yourself on a recording played at the wrong speed. We need to talk. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat like a fish hook. The journal slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a sound like thunder. You've been reading our story, the other me continued, stepping into the room. Their footsteps made no sound on the hardwood, but stories need endings, don't they? I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The other me moved closer, and I could smell something strange. Ozone, like the air before a storm, mixed with ink and old paper. We can't both exist in the same space, they said, their voice growing softer, more hypnotic. One of us has to sleep so the other can live. One of us has to forget so the other can remember. That's how it's always been. But which one are you? I finally managed to whisper. The other me smiled wider, and I realized I couldn't feel my own face. I couldn't tell if I was smiling too. That's the beautiful question, isn't it? They said. The one we'll spend eternity trying to answer. The room began to darken around the edges, like an old photograph burning. The other me reached out their hand, palm up, waiting. Come, they said. Let's write the ending together. I looked down at the journal on the floor. Its pages were flipping themselves now, faster and faster. Ink bleeding from one page to the next, until all the words became one continuous stream of consciousness. One endless sentence describing a life I may or may not have lived. When I looked up again, the other me was gone. But I could hear them somewhere close. The scratch of pen on paper, the whisper of pages turning, the soft sound of someone writing a story that would never end. I picked up the journal. The pages were blank again, waiting for the next entry. My hand moved to write, but I couldn't tell if the words were my own or if someone else was moving my fingers across the page. I found the journal on a Tuesday morning. I wrote, watching the words appear as if by magic. The leather cover felt warm against my fingertips, as if someone had just been holding it. Outside, it was still Tuesday morning. It would always be Tuesday morning. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between remembering and forgetting, between the writer and the reader, the story would continue, word by word, page by page, until there was nothing left but ink and intention, and the endless question of who was telling the story and who was living it. The journal grew heavier in my hands, filled with words that hadn't been written yet, but somehow already existed, waiting to be discovered again and again, like a song playing on repeat in an empty room, like a reflection that moves a heartbeat after you do, like the sound of your own voice calling your name from a dream you can't quite remember. Story 3. The notification sound pierced through the evening quiet like a needle through silk. I had grown accustomed to that particular chime, the soft, 2-note melody that meant another text message had arrived. But this time, something felt different. The sound lingered in the air longer than usual, as if the very molecules of sound were reluctant to fade. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window where the last traces of daylight still painted the walls in shades of amber and rust. The fabric beneath my fingers felt familiar, worn smooth by countless evenings just like this one. My phone lay on the small table beside me, its screen glowing with that cold, blue light that had become so much a part of our modern existence. The message was from my own number. I stared at the screen, blinking slowly, wondering if perhaps the fatigue from the day was playing tricks with my vision. But no, there it was, clear as daylight, my own contact name at the top of the message thread. Below it, just 2 words in that stark, digital font. Run now. My thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. The phone felt heavier than it should have, as if gravity itself had intensified in this small space around my chair. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, mixing with the distant hum of traffic outside my window. The sound of my heartbeat began to drum in my ears, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the blinking cursor on my phone. I typed back, my fingers moving almost without my permission. "Who is this?" The response came immediately, faster than humanly possible. The typing indicator hadn't even appeared. "You know who this is. Check the time on the message." My eyes moved to the timestamp, and a chill ran down my spine like cold water. The message had been sent at 9:47 p.m. I glanced at the clock on my phone status bar, 9:46 p.m. The message had come from the future, from me, in the future. I set the phone down on the table with deliberate care, as if it were made of the most fragile glass. The evening air in my apartment felt thick now, almost viscous, like I was breathing through honey. Every sound seemed amplified, the tick of the wall clock, the settling of the building's old bones, the whisper of air moving through the ventilation system. Another chime, another message from myself. The door. Listen to the door. I turned my head slowly toward my front door, though I couldn't see it from where I sat, but I could hear it now that I was paying attention. A soft sound, barely audible, like fingernails dragging across wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. So gentle it could have been mistaken for tree branches against the window, if there had been any trees close enough to reach. My phone buzzed again. "Do you hear them? They're almost through." "Through what?" I typed, though my hands were shaking now, making it difficult to hit the right keys. The door. The walls, the space between what is and what isn't. I stood up from the chair, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The familiar weight of my body seemed foreign now, as if I were wearing someone else's skin. I moved toward the hallway that led to my front door, each step echoing strangely in the confined space. The sound of my footsteps seemed to come from both ahead of me and behind me, creating an acoustic impossibility that made my head spin. The scratching at the door had grown more distinct now. Not fingernails, something harder, more deliberate. Metal against wood, perhaps, or bone. Another message appeared on my screen without a sound this time, as if my phone had learned to whisper. "Don't open it. Whatever you do, don't open the door." Then what should I do? I whispered to my phone, to myself, to whatever version of me existed in those impossible future minutes. Remember the other door. The one you've been avoiding. My blood turned to ice. There was another door. In my bedroom, there had always been a second door that I had never opened. The landlord had mentioned it when I moved in. Something about it being sealed off, leading to a part of the building that was no longer in use. I had furniture pushed against it, a bookshelf full of novels I never read. Books with titles that seemed to change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I made my way to the bedroom. My phone clutched in my hand like a talisman. The screen cast strange shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. The bookshelf stood exactly where I had left it, pressed against the door that shouldn't exist. But tonight, I could see light seeping around the edges of the frame. Warm, golden light that pulsed gently, like breathing. My phone buzzed. That's the way out. But you have to choose now. They're almost through the front door. The scratching sound had indeed grown louder, more urgent. It was joined now by what sounded like whispers, voices speaking words in a language that felt familiar, but which I couldn't quite understand. The words seemed to seep under the front door and flow through the apartment like smoke, reaching into every corner. I began moving the bookshelf, book by book, volume by volume. My hands worked faster than my mind could keep up with. The books felt strangely warm to the touch, their pages whispering against each other as I moved them. Some of the titles I recognized, classics I remembered reading in school. Others seemed to be written in alphabets that hurt to look at directly. With the shelf finally clear, I could see the door properly. It was painted white, just like all the other doors in my apartment. But there was something different about its proportions. It seemed both too tall and too narrow, as if it had been designed for beings who were not quite human. The handle turned easily under my touch, yet despite the fact that it should have been locked, sealed, impossible to open. The hinges didn't creak as the door swung inward. Instead, they sang, a high, clear note that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. Beyond the door was not another room, but a corridor that stretched further than should have been possible given the layout of my building. The walls were covered in the same wallpaper as my apartment, but the pattern seemed to move subtly when I wasn't looking directly at it. The golden light came from no visible source, but it filled the space with a warmth that felt like summer afternoons and childhood memories. My phone buzzed one final time. "This is where you've always been going. You just forgot for a while." Behind me, the scratching at the front door had stopped. In its place came a sound like rain, but rain that fell upward, cascading from the floor to the ceiling. I turned to look, but the hallway behind me was already fading, becoming translucent, like a photograph overexposed to light. I stepped through the doorway. The corridor ahead of me stretched on and on, lined with doors on both sides. Some were open, revealing glimpses of rooms I thought I recognized. My childhood bedroom, my grandmother's kitchen, a classroom where I had once felt safe. Others remained closed, but I could hear sounds coming from behind them: laughter, music, conversations in voices that sounded almost like people I had once known. I walked forward, my footsteps muffled by carpet that felt like moss underfoot. My phone had grown silent, its screen dark, but I could feel it growing lighter in my hand with each step I took. When I looked down, I saw that it was becoming transparent, like everything else behind me. The corridor seemed to breathe around me, its walls expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I realized that I was not walking through a hallway at all, but through something alive, something that had been waiting for me to find my way back to it. At the very edge of my hearing, I could make out a sound like singing. Voices calling my name, but not the name I had been using for the past several years. They were calling me by a name I had forgotten, a name that belonged to the person I had been before I learned to be afraid of doors that shouldn't exist and messages from myself. I kept walking, deeper into the golden light, toward the voices that knew my real name. Behind me, the world I had been living in continued to fade, becoming nothing more than a story someone had once told, a dream someone had almost remembered upon waking. The last thing I heard from my phone, just before it disappeared completely, was my own voice, clear and certain. "Welcome home." I smiled and walked on, finally understanding that I had never been running away from something. I had been running back to myself. Story 4. I waked to the sound of rain against glass, a gentle percussion that has always comforted me. My eyes opened slowly, expecting to see the familiar outline of my dresser against the far wall, the soft glow of the digital clock on the nightstand to my left, the doorway to the bathroom where it's always been. Straight ahead, 3 steps from the foot of my bed. But everything is wrong. The dresser looms directly in front of me, so close I could reach out and touch it without fully extending my arm. The clock glows red from my right side, not my left, and its numbers read 40:33 a.m. in digits that seem somehow sharper, more aggressive than I remember. The bathroom door is nowhere to be seen, and in its place stands a tall bookshelf filled with volumes whose spines are too dark to read in the dim light. I lie perfectly still, my heart beginning to quicken as I process this impossible rearrangement. Every piece of furniture in my bedroom has been moved during my sleep, repositioned with surgical precision while I lay unconscious just feet away. The bed itself feels different too, lower to the ground, the mattress firmer beneath my body, the pillows arranged at an angle that puts a subtle crick in my neck. The rain continues its steady rhythm, but now it sounds wrong as well. Too regular, too precise. Like drops falling from a great height onto metal, rather than the organic patter I've known all my life. I turn my head toward the window, and even that movement feels foreign in this new geography of my room. The window is where it should be, but the view beyond it has changed. Instead of the oak tree that has stood outside my bedroom for the 7 years I've lived here, I see the skeletal outline of a street lamp I don't recognize, its light casting harsh shadows across unfamiliar rooftops. The neighboring house, the one with the blue shutters and the garden gnome by the front steps, is gone, replaced by a structure that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. I sit up slowly, testing the boundaries of this new space. My feet, when they touch the floor, find carpet instead of the hardwood I went to sleep on. The carpet is thick, plush, with a texture that seems to grasp at my toes like tiny fingers. Each step I take toward the dresser produces no sound. The carpet swallows every footfall completely. The dresser itself is mine, I'm certain of that. The same oak finish, the same brass handles, the same water ring on the top, from where I once left a sweating glass overnight. But the mirror above it reflects a room I've never seen before. In the reflection, the bed is positioned diagonally. The walls are painted a deep blue, instead of the cream I chose when I first moved in. And there are windows on walls where there should be only solid plaster. I reach out to touch the mirror's surface, and my fingers meet something that feels less like glass and more like still water. The reflection ripples slightly at my touch, distorting my face into something that looks almost, but not quite, like me. When I pull my hand away, the image settles back into that impossible room with its diagonal bed and blue walls. The digital clock's glow draws my attention again. 4:33 a.m. The same as before. The numbers aren't changing. I watch for what feels like several minutes, but the display remains frozen, as if time itself has been rearranged along with everything else. I turn toward where the bathroom door should be, where it has always been, and find myself face to face with that bookshelf. The volumes on its shelves are thick, leather-bound, with titles embossed in gold leaf. But as I lean closer to read them, the letters seem to shift and blur, rearranging themselves into words and languages I don't recognize, then back into English, then into symbols that hurt to look at directly. One book, positioned at eye level, bears my name on its spine. Not a book I own, not a book I've ever seen, but there it is, my first and last name in elegant script, glowing faintly in the red light from the clock. I reach for it, but my fingers pass through the shelf as if it's made of shadows. The book remains tantalizingly out of reach, even as I can see it with perfect clarity. Behind me, the bed creaks. I spin around to find the covers pulled back, the sheets rumpled as if someone has just climbed out. But I'm standing here, feet on the impossibly soft carpet, nowhere near the bed. The impression left in the mattress is human, shaped but somehow wrong. Too long, or too narrow, or positioned at an angle that no person could naturally assume while sleeping. The rain against the window grows louder, more insistent. When I look toward the sound, I realize that what I thought was rain is actually something else entirely. Tiny objects are striking the glass. Not water droplets, but small, dark things that I can't quite make out in the dim light. They hit the window with the regularity of rainfall, but each impact produces a small, sharp crack in the glass. I approach the window cautiously, the carpet seeming to grow thicker with each step until I feel like I'm wading through something that reaches past my ankles. The objects hitting the glass are coins, I realize. Pennies falling from the sky like rain, each one adding another hairline fracture to the window. The cracks form patterns as they spread, not random spider webs, but deliberate designs that look almost like letters, like words trying to form themselves in the breaking glass. When I press my face close to the window to get a better look, my breath fogs the glass, but instead of the usual cloud of condensation, my breath forms words. You moved everything. The letters appear backward, as if written from the other side of the glass, and they fade slowly, leaving only the continuing percussion of falling coins and the spreading web of cracks. I back away from the window and nearly stumble over something that wasn't there before. A small table, positioned precisely where I would need to step. On the table sits an old rotary phone, its black surface reflecting the red glow of the clock. But the phone is ringing, but the sound is muffled, as if it's coming from underwater or from very far away. I lift the receiver, and the ringing stops immediately. The silence that follows is profound, more complete than any quiet I've ever experienced. Even my own breathing seems muted, absorbed by the walls of this rearranged room. "Hello," I whisper into the phone. "You're awake," comes a voice from the other end. It's my voice, but speaking words I'm not saying, coming from a mouth that isn't mine. "I was wondering when you'd notice." "Notice what?" "That I've been rearranging things, a little each night while you sleep, moving everything just slightly, just enough to make you question what you remember." "Who are you?" "I'm you, obviously. The you that stays awake while you sleep. The you that knows this room better than you do, because I've been watching you sleep in it every night for 7 years." I look around the room. The dresser too close, the clock on the wrong side, the bookshelf where the bathroom should be. Why? Because you never really looked at it before. You never noticed the water ring on the dresser, or the way the light from the street lamp hit the wall, or how the floorboards creaked in exactly 3 places between the bed and the door. You lived here, but you never really saw it. So I had to make you see. The phone grows warm in my hand, then hot, then scalding. I drop it, and it lands on the carpet with no sound at all. The receiver continues to emit my voice, talking to itself now, explaining how it moved the furniture piece by piece, night after night, mapping my sleep patterns, learning the exact depth of my unconsciousness. I run toward where the door should be, but find only more bookshelves, a stretching up to a ceiling that seems to have grown higher in the past few minutes. The books whisper as I pass them, my name repeated in dozens of voices, all slightly different, all claiming to be mine. The clock still reads 4:33 a.m. The coins still fall against the cracking window. The bed still bears the impression of something that isn't quite human. And somewhere in the distance, growing closer, I can hear the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. Heavy wood scraping against carpet. Metal legs squeaking as they're repositioned. The rearrangement is continuing, even now, even while I'm awake to witness it. I press my back against a bookshelf and slide down to the floor, the too soft carpet embracing me like quicksand. Above me, the books whisper my name in harmony, a chorus of my own voice telling me stories about the room. I thought I knew, the room that has been slowly, carefully, lovingly rearranged around my sleeping form. The furniture moves closer, and I begin to understand that perhaps I've never been awake at all. Perhaps this is all just another rearrangement, another careful repositioning of the elements of my perception. Perhaps tomorrow I'll wake up in a room I recognize, with the dresser against the far wall and the clock on the proper side. Or perhaps tomorrow the room will be different again, rearranged once more by the part of me that never sleeps, that watches and waits and moves, things just enough to keep me guessing whether any of this is real. Story 5. I discovered it on a Thursday evening when the autumn rain was drumming its fingers against my bedroom window. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, like a lullaby played on glass and stone. I had just returned from work, my mind still foggy with the day's mundane concerns. Deadlines, emails, the endless cycle of tasks that filled the spaces between morning and night. My bedroom door creaked as I pushed it open. The familiar sound that had greeted me every evening for the past 3 years since I'd moved into this apartment. The floorboards beneath my feet knew the weight of my steps, responding with their usual soft groans and sighs. Everything was exactly as I had left it that morning, except for the second bed. It sat against the far wall, parallel to my own, as if it had always been there. The same white iron frame, the same blue bedding, even the same slight indent in the pillow where a head might rest. For a moment, I wondered if I was seeing double, if exhaustion had finally caught up with me in some tangible way. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and opened them again. 2 beds. Still 2 beds. I approached the new bed slowly, my sock-covered feet silent on the wooden floor. The bedding looked fresh, recently made, the corners tucked with hospital precision. When I reached out to touch the comforter, it felt real enough. Cotton and down, and the slight coolness of fabric that had been sitting undisturbed in an empty room. But my room hadn't been empty. I had been living here, sleeping here, breathing here for 3 years. I sat on the edge of the mysterious bed, and it responded to my weight with the same small complaints that my own bed made. The mattress had the same firmness, the same subtle valley that forms when a bed has been slept in regularly. As if someone had been using this bed for exactly as long as I had been using mine. The rain continued its percussion against the window, and in that steady rhythm, I began to notice other sounds. The building settling, as old buildings do. The whisper of air moving through the heating vents, and something else. Something so soft, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Breathing. Not my own breathing, which had grown shallow and quick in the strangeness of the moment. This was different. Deeper, slower. The rhythm of someone in deep sleep. It seemed to come from the pillow beside me, as if an invisible head rested there, lungs expanding and contracting in the peaceful cadence of dreams. I pulled my hand away from the bed and stood up quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound continued, steady and undeniable. I walked around the foot of the bed, studying it from different angles, looking for some explanation that would make sense of what I was experiencing. The bed was perfectly ordinary, perfectly real, perfectly impossible. I decided to ignore it. Perhaps it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination, a manifestation of overwork and too many late nights. I went about my evening routine, changing clothes, brushing teeth, preparing for sleep, while deliberately avoiding looking at the second bed. But I could feel it there, present in my peripheral vision, taking up space that shouldn't exist in a room I knew by heart. When I finally turned off the lights and climbed into my own bed, the breathing sound became more pronounced. In the darkness, it was impossible to ignore. It matched my own rhythm for a while, as if we were synchronizing, and then gradually began to shift, becoming deeper, more relaxed. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of someone else sleeping in my room. The rain had stopped, and in the new quiet, I could hear other things too. The soft rustle of fabric as the invisible sleeper shifted position, the tiny creak of bed springs adjusting to movement. Once I could have sworn I heard a sigh, soft and contented, the sound someone makes when settling into particularly pleasant dreams. When morning came, the second bed was still there. I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in months. I needed time to think, to understand what was happening to me. I spent the day researching everything I could think of. Hallucinations, stress disorders, carbon monoxide poisoning, anything that might explain why my bedroom had spontaneously grown an extra bed. But the bed remained stubbornly real. I could sit on it, lie on it, even sleep on it during an afternoon nap. When I did, I dreamed of conversations with someone I couldn't see, someone who knew things about my life that I had never told anyone. We talked about childhood fears and forgotten ambitions, about the small compromises that accumulate over years until you barely recognize the person you've become. That evening, as I prepared for bed again, I found myself talking to the empty air above the second bed's pillow. "Who are you?" I whispered to the darkness. The breathing paused for just a moment, as if the invisible sleeper had heard me and was considering whether to answer. Then it resumed unchanged. Over the following days, the second bed became a fixture in my routine. I would return from work to find it exactly as I had left it, but somehow more present, more substantial. The breathing sound grew familiar, almost comforting. I began to think of it as having a presence, a personality distinct from my own. The invisible occupant seemed to have different sleep patterns than I did. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to hear movement from the other bed. The sound of someone getting up, walking around the room. I never saw anything, but I could feel the displacement of air, the subtle change in the room's atmosphere when someone else was moving through it. During these midnight visits, objects in my room would sometimes be rearranged. Not dramatically, just small adjustments. A book moved from the nightstand to the dresser. A glass of water that I was certain I had left on the windowsill, now sitting on my desk. My clothes folded differently than I remembered folding them. I began leaving notes for my invisible roommate. Simple messages written on index cards and left on the second bed's pillow. "Hello. Thank you for folding my shirts. Do you have a name?" The notes were always gone by morning, but there were never any replies. Just the continued breathing, the sense of presence, the small kindnesses that suggested someone was looking after me in ways I didn't fully understand. Weeks passed. I stopped trying to explain the second bed to myself and simply accepted it as part of my reality. I bought extra pillows, additional blankets, even a second lamp for the nightstand that had appeared beside the mysterious bed. If I was sharing my space with someone, I reasoned, I might as well be a good host. It was during the 4th week that I woke to find a note on my own pillow. The handwriting looked like mine, but slightly different. The same basic shapes, but with subtle variations in pressure and angle, as if written by someone who had learned to write by watching me form letters. "Thank you for making room for me," the note said. "I've been trying to come home for so long." I sat up in bed, my hands trembling as I held the piece of paper. The other bed was empty, as always, but I could sense attention focused on me from that direction, as if someone was sitting there in the darkness, watching me read. "Home." I whispered to the air. The response came not as a voice, but as a feeling, a sudden flood of memories that didn't belong to me. I saw myself as a child, but not as I remembered being. This version of me was braver, more curious, less afraid of the dark corners of the world. I saw myself making different choices, staying in school longer, traveling to places I had only dreamed of visiting, maintaining friendships that I had allowed to fade away. I saw the life I might have lived if I had been just slightly different, just a little more willing to take risks. The realization came slowly, like sunrise creeping across a landscape. The second bed wasn't for someone else. It was for another version of me, one who had been displaced somehow, set adrift from the life that should have been theirs. All those small kindnesses, the folded clothes and moved objects, weren't the actions of a stranger taking care of me. They were my own actions, performed by hands I couldn't see, guided by a heart that beat in rhythm with my own. "How long have you been here?" I asked the darkness. The answer came as another wave of memory feelings, years, maybe decades. This other version of me had been trying to find their way back to a life that felt real, a life that belonged to them. They had been living in the spaces between decisions, in the shadow cast by the choices I had made instead of the ones they would have made. "What do you want?" I whispered. This time the response was immediate and clear, though it came from inside my own thoughts rather than from any external source. "I want to remember what it feels like to be whole." I lay back down on my pillow, still holding the note. Across the room, I heard the sound of someone else settling into bed, sheets rustling, a sigh of contentment. But for the first time since the second bed had appeared, the breathing sounds began to synchronize with my own. As I drifted toward sleep, I had the strangest sensation of expansion, as if the boundaries of my body were dissolving and reforming, becoming larger, more complete. I dreamed of conversations with myself, comparing notes on the paths we had taken, the regrets we carried, the hopes we still held. When I woke the next morning, there was only one bed in my room, but I felt, for the first time in years, like I was entirely present in my own life. The person looking back at me from the bathroom mirror had the same face I had always worn, but their eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, a sense of completion that I couldn't quite name, but which felt like coming home after a very long journey. I went about my morning routine with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. As I prepared to leave for work, I paused at the spot where the second bed had been. The floor showed no indication that anything had ever been there. But I could still feel the warmth of presence, not as something separate from me, but as something that had always been part of who I was. Thank you. I whispered to the empty air, to myself, to the version of me who had finally found their way home. The room seemed to exhale in response, settling into a peace that felt both new and ancient, like a question that had finally found its answer. Story 6. The dream always begins the same way, with the taste of copper pennies on my tongue, and the feeling that I'm drowning in thick, honey-colored air. I'm standing in my childhood bedroom, but it's wrong somehow. The proportions stretched like taffy. The walls breathing in and out with a rhythm that doesn't match my heartbeat. I try to call out for my mother, the way I used to when nightmares would chase me from sleep. But when I open my mouth, nothing emerges. Not even the whisper of breath. The silence is so complete it has weight, pressing against my eardrums, filling the spaces where sound should be. This is when I know I'm dreaming, but the knowledge brings no comfort. In this place between sleeping and waking, logic holds no power. I can understand that my physical body is lying safely in my bed, sheets twisted around my legs, face pressed into the pillow that smells faintly of lavender detergent. But here, in this stretched version of childhood, I am trapped in my own throat. I reach up to touch my neck, and my fingers find skin that feels too smooth, too tight, like scar tissue grown over an old wound. There's no Adam's apple, no hint of the vocal cords that should vibrate with sound. It's as if that part of me simply doesn't exist in this place. The bedroom door stands ajar, and through the gap I can see the hallway of my childhood home. The carpet is the same deep green I remember, but it ripples like water, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. I can hear sounds coming from downstairs, the television, the clatter of dishes, my father's laugh mixing with voices I don't recognize. They're having dinner without me. I try to move toward the door, but my feet feel rooted to the floor, as if I've grown into the boards like some strange tree. The effort of trying to lift my legs sends panic shooting through my chest, and I open my mouth wider, straining to produce even the smallest sound. A whimper, a whisper. Anything, nothing. The silence that emerges from my throat isn't empty. It's full of all the words I can't speak, crowded with syllables that pile up behind my teeth like snow against a closed door. I can feel them there, pressing against the inside of my mouth, desperate to escape. But some invisible barrier holds them back, sealing them inside me, where they grow heavy and begin to taste like rust. From downstairs, I hear my name being called. My mother's voice, warm and concerned. The way it sounded when I was 7 and had hidden under the dining room table, afraid to admit that I had broken her favorite vase. Dinner's ready. She calls, and then, after a pause, "Are you coming down?" I try to answer, try to shout that I'm here, that I need help, that something is wrong with my voice. But the words just accumulate in my chest like stones, making it hard to breathe. My silence stretches out, filling the house, and I can sense their worry growing. Footsteps on the stairs. My father's voice joining my mother's. "Is everything okay up there?" The bedroom begins to change around me. The walls grow taller, stretching toward a ceiling that disappears into darkness. My bed, my desk, My bookshelf full of childhood stories. Everything shrinks until I feel like I'm standing in a giant's room, surrounded by toy furniture. But I remain the same size, unable to grow or shrink to match my surroundings. I hear them talking about me now, their voices drifting up through the floorboards. They're worried. They're saying my name over and over, but it sounds different each time, as if they're forgetting how to pronounce it correctly. The syllables shift and change, becoming foreign, belonging to someone I don't recognize. Maybe we should call someone. My mother says, and her voice sounds farther away now, as if she's moving through the house, searching rooms I can't see. Maybe she's just tired. My father replies, but his words lack conviction. I want to tell them that I'm right here, that I haven't gone anywhere. I want to explain that something has happened to my voice, that I need their help to find it again. But when I try to form the words, my throat constricts, muscles tightening like a fist closing around air. The room continues to transform. The walls begin to sprout doors. Dozens of them, all different sizes and colors, some so small I would have to crawl through them, others so tall they disappear into the shadows above. Each door stands slightly open, revealing glimpses of other spaces, other versions of rooms I think I recognize. Through one door, I can see my current bedroom, the one in my adult apartment. My sleeping body lies there, restless legs kicking at the sheets. My face is contorted with the effort of trying to scream, mouth open wide. But the room around my physical form is perfectly quiet. Through another door, I see a classroom where I once gave a presentation, my voice clear and confident as I spoke about photosynthesis to my 4th grade class. The memory of how it felt to have words flow freely from my mouth fills me with longing so sharp it feels like drowning in reverse. A third door shows me a future I might inhabit, myself at a podium, speaking to hundreds of people who hang on every word. But even as I watch this version of myself, I can see her voice beginning to fade, words becoming whispers, whispers becoming nothing, but the movement of lips around empty air. The sounds from downstairs have changed. My parents are no longer calling my name. Instead, I hear them talking to other people. Strangers whose voices carry the authority of professionals. They're discussing me in past tense, as if I'm already gone. She was always a quiet child, my mother is saying, and the words echo strangely, bouncing off the walls of the impossible room. Maybe too quiet. I realize that my silence has become more than the absence of sound. It has become a presence, a thing that takes up space, that has weight and temperature. I can feel it spreading through the house like smoke, filling every room, seeping into the furniture and the walls until the entire structure is saturated with my inability to speak. I try to move toward one of the doors, thinking that maybe if I can reach another version of myself, I can borrow their voice. But my feet have grown roots now, literal roots that burrow deep into the floorboards and spread through the foundation of the house. I am becoming part of the architecture of silence. The taste of copper in my mouth grows stronger, and I realize that I've been biting my tongue, trying to force sound through pain. But even the taste of my own blood makes no sound as I swallow it. Even my heartbeat has grown quiet, as if my body is learning to exist without the usual percussion of life. Through the largest door, I can see myself as a baby, lying in a crib, crying with the full power of new lungs. The sound is so beautiful, so pure and desperate and alive, that I feel tears streaming down my face. When did I lose that ability? When did my voice begin its retreat into the spaces between my ribs? I remember now fragments of moments when I chose silence over speaking. Times when I had something important to say, but swallowed the words instead. Afraid they would be wrong, afraid they would be too much or not enough. Each swallowed word took up residence inside me, and over time, they built walls around my voice, protecting it and imprisoning it at the same time. The strangers downstairs are leaving now. I can hear car doors closing, engines starting. My parents' voices sound hollow, empty, as if they too have lost something vital. The house settles into a quiet that feels permanent. A quiet that will outlast the furniture and the photographs and all the other evidence that I once lived here. But in this deep silence, I begin to hear something new. Not sound exactly, but the memory of sound, the echo of every word I ever spoke, preserved somewhere in the walls and the floors and the air itself. They're all still here, waiting. I close my eyes and reach for them, not with my hands, which are still rooted to the floor, but with something deeper, some part of myself that exists beyond the physical. I gather up the scattered syllables of my past, the laughter and the conversations, and the songs I used to sing in the shower when I thought no one could hear. Slowly, carefully, I begin to assemble them into something new. Not words that I speak, but words that I am. They flow through my veins instead of my throat, pulsing with the rhythm of my heart, filling the empty spaces that silence has carved inside me. The room begins to shift again, walls folding inward, doors closing one by one. But I'm no longer afraid. I understand now that my voice was never gone. It just changed its location. Instead of living in my throat, it has taken up residence in my bones, in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between one heartbeat and the next. When I wake from the dream, my bedroom is filled with the soft sounds of morning. Birds outside the window, traffic in the distance, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I sit up and touch my throat, feeling the familiar bump of my Adam's apple, the gentle vibration of my pulse. I open my mouth and whisper, "Hello," and the word emerges perfectly formed, real and substantial in the morning air. But I can still feel the weight of all those unspoken words inside me, and I know they're there for a reason. Not every thought needs to become sound. Not every feeling requires a voice. Some truths are meant to be carried in silence, to be shared through the language of presence rather than speech. I lie back down and listen to the quiet sounds of the world waking up around me. In the space between sleep and full consciousness, I can still hear the echo of that profound silence from my dream, and it no longer frightens me. It feels like coming home to a part of myself I had forgotten existed. The part that knows how to speak in languages that have no words. Story 7. It began with the photograph of my birthday dinner, the one I had taken just 3 nights ago at the small restaurant downtown where they know my order by heart. I remember setting up the shot carefully. The warm golden light from the table lamp, the half-eaten slice of chocolate cake, the single candle still flickering in its small pool of wax. I remember checking the image on my phone's screen. Satisfied with how the composition had turned out, before posting it to my social media with a simple caption about another year older, another year grateful. But when I looked at the photo again this morning, scrolling through my recent images while sipping coffee in the familiar quiet of my kitchen, there was someone else at the table. A woman I had never seen before sat across from me, her face partially obscured by shadows, but clearly present, clearly real. She wore a dark sweater that seemed to absorb light, and her hands rested on the table in a mirror image of my own pose. Most unsettling of all, she appeared to be looking directly at me, or rather, directly at whoever was taking the photograph. Her eyes held a patient quality, as if she had been waiting for a very long time to be noticed. I stared at the screen until my coffee grew cold, zooming in on her face, trying to find some explanation for her presence. Perhaps it was a reflection, some trick of light and glass that had created the illusion of another person. But the restaurant had been nearly empty that night, and I had been sitting with my back to the wall, facing the main dining room. There were no mirrors, no surfaces that could have created such an elaborate optical illusion. The woman in the photograph looked solid, three-dimensional, as real as I appeared in the same frame. I scrolled through more images, my heart beginning to pound with a rhythm that felt foreign in my chest. There she was again, standing behind me in the selfie I had taken at the park last weekend, her figure barely visible between the trees, but undeniably present. In another photo, from the museum visit 2 weeks ago, she sat on a bench in the background, reading a book, as if she belonged there as naturally as any other visitor. How had I not seen her before? How had I managed to photograph someone repeatedly without being aware of their presence? I pulled up the image from my friend Sarah's wedding last month, the one where I'm standing with the other guests during the ceremony. The bride and groom are exchanging vows in the center of the frame, everyone's attention focused on the couple. Everyone except the woman in the dark sweater, who stands at the very edge of the photograph. Her gaze fixed on me with that same patient intensity. My hands were shaking now, making it difficult to operate the phone's touch screen. I set it down on the kitchen table and tried to think rationally about what I was seeing. Mass hallucination seemed unlikely. I was alone in my apartment, looking at digital images on a device that dealt only in pixels and data. Equipment malfunction was possible, but the woman appeared in photographs taken with different cameras, in different lighting conditions, over a period of several months. I picked up the phone again and called Sarah, my fingers fumbling with the numbers. "Can you do me a favor?" I asked when she answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you look at that group photo from your wedding, the one I posted on Instagram, the one with all the guests during the ceremony?" "Sure, hold on." I could hear her tapping at her phone. "Okay, I'm looking at it. What about it? Do you see anyone you don't recognize? Anyone who wasn't supposed to be there?" A pause. "No, I see all our friends and family." "Why? What's wrong? Count the people in the photo. Count them carefully." Another pause, longer this time. "I count 37 people, which sounds about right for the number of guests we had." "Is everything okay? You sound stressed." I was looking at the same photograph, and I counted 38. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the sounds of the building around me. footsteps in the apartment above, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic. Normal sounds that belonged to a normal world where photographs contained only the people who had actually been present when the shutter clicked. But normalcy felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I began going through my photos systematically. Months and months of images stored on my phone and backed up to various cloud services. The further back I went, the more frequently she appeared. In vacation photos from 6 months ago, she stood at the edge of scenic overlooks, always just outside the main focus of the image. In pictures from my nephew's birthday party, she sat at a table in the background, her face turned toward the camera with that same expectant expression. In every image, she wore the same dark sweater, the same patient demeanor, as if she existed in a perpetual state of waiting. The oldest photograph containing her presence dated back almost 2 years. A casual snapshot I had taken of my morning coffee at the cafe near my office. She was reflected in the window behind me, but not as a reflection should appear. While my own reflection showed me facing the camera, she appeared to be looking directly outward. Through the glass, her eyes meeting mine across time and pixels. I realized with growing horror that she had been documenting my life for longer than I had been aware of living it. The afternoon light filtering through my kitchen window began to take on a strange quality, as if the air itself had thickened. I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, checking the corners of my apartment for any sign of presence other than my own. The familiar space suddenly felt compromised, no longer the safe haven I had always considered it to be. I decided to take a new photograph, a test of sorts. I set up my phone on the kitchen counter, angled to capture myself sitting at the table. I could see the entire room in the viewfinder. No hidden spaces, no areas where someone could conceal themselves. The apartment was empty except for me. I took the photo and immediately checked the result. There she was, sitting across from me at the table. Her hands folded in the same position they had been in the restaurant photograph. But this time, something was different. This time, she was looking directly at the camera with what appeared to be relief, as if she had finally been acknowledged after a very long period of being ignored. I dropped the phone, and it clattered against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. When I picked it up with trembling hands, the photograph remained unchanged. She was still there, still looking at me with those patient, knowing eyes. That evening, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. I tried reading, but the words seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that resembled the shadows I had seen around the woman's face. I tried watching television, but every commercial break seemed to last exactly long enough for me to forget what I had been watching, as if time itself was stuttering. When I finally went to bed, I placed my phone face down on the nightstand, afraid to look at any more images. But sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, not frightening exactly, but impossibly present, impossibly real. She had been watching my life unfold from the margins of my photographs, a silent witness to moments I had thought were private. I woke sometime after midnight to the soft chime of a notification on my phone. Half asleep and disoriented, I reached for it automatically. the way one does when pulled from dreams by the insistent call of technology. A new photo had been added to my camera roll. I hadn't taken any pictures since the afternoon test in my kitchen, and my phone had been on the nightstand beside me all evening. But there it was, a photograph taken at 12 hours and 47 a.m., just moments before the notification had woken me. The image showed my bedroom in the darkness, illuminated only by the faint light from the street lamp outside my window. I could see my own sleeping form in the bed, face peaceful, unaware. And sitting in the chair beside the window, barely visible in the shadows, was the woman in the dark sweater. She was no longer looking at the camera. Instead, her gaze was fixed on my sleeping form, her expression one of protective vigilance, as if she had been standing guard while I rested. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in the quiet room. The chair by the window stood empty, exactly as it had when I went to sleep. But the photograph on my phone told a different story, one in which I was never truly alone, never truly unobserved. I spent the remainder of the night sitting up in bed, my back against the headboard, afraid to close my eyes. Every shadow in the room seemed to hold potential presence. Every creak of the building suggested movement where there should be none, but nothing happened. No new photographs appeared. No figures materialized from the darkness. As dawn approached, I began to think more clearly about what I was experiencing. The woman in my photographs wasn't threatening. She appeared to be protective, almost maternal in her constant watchfulness. She had been present during happy moments and difficult ones, celebrations and ordinary afternoons, as if she genuinely cared about the events of my life. But who was she? And why could I see her only through the lens of a camera, only after the fact, never in real time? I made coffee as the sun rose, going through the familiar motions of grinding beans and heating water. Activities that felt reassuring in their normalcy. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I picked up my phone and scrolled back through the photographs one more time, looking for clues I might have missed. In the earliest images, those from nearly 2 years ago, the woman appeared young, perhaps my age or slightly older. But as I moved forward chronologically through the photographs, I noticed subtle changes in her appearance. Her hair grew slightly grayer. Small lines appeared around her eyes. Her posture became more settled. She was aging in parallel with me, as if our lives were somehow synchronized. The realization came to me slowly, like sunrise creeping across a landscape. I opened the photo editing app on my phone and began adjusting the lighting and contrast on the most recent image, the one showing her sitting beside my bed. As I brightened the shadows and enhanced the details, her features became clearer. The shape of her nose, the curve of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders. I was looking at an older version of myself. Not identical. Her hair was different. Her clothes were styles I had never worn. Her expression held a depth of experience that I didn't yet possess. But the fundamental architecture of her face, the essential structure beneath the surface differences, was unmistakably mine. I was being watched over by my future self, a version of me who had somehow found a way to step outside the normal flow of time and space, to exist in the margins of photographs, to bear witness to the life I was living now from the vantage point of the life I would someday lead. The coffee maker chimed, signaling that it had finished brewing, but I barely heard it. I was too busy staring at my phone, at this impossible photograph of myself, watching myself sleep. Questions flooded my mind. How was this possible? Why was it happening? What did it mean for my understanding of time and identity and the nature of existence itself? But beneath the questions, I felt something unexpected. Comfort. I was not alone. I had never been alone. My future self had been with me, through every moment of uncertainty, every small triumph, every ordinary day that had seemed insignificant, but which had actually been building toward something larger. I took a new photograph then, a selfie in the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. This time, I wasn't surprised to see her in the frame. Sitting at the table behind me, her face turned toward the camera with a gentle smile that was both familiar and strange. For the first time since I had noticed her presence, she raised her hand in a small wave. I waved back, knowing that she couldn't see me in real time, but understanding that somewhere in her own timeline, her own version of this moment, she would know that I had finally seen her, finally understood. The photograph captured both of us, past and future, observer and observed, the person I am and the person I will become. Connected across the strange geography of time, by nothing more than light and pixels, and the mysterious persistence of love that extends beyond the boundaries of the present moment. I saved the image to my camera roll and went to pour my coffee, no longer afraid of what I might find in my photographs. Instead, I felt grateful for this impossible gift, the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever joys and sorrows awaited me, I would never face them entirely alone. Somewhere in the spaces between moments, my future self would be watching, remembering, keeping guard over the path that had brought her to wherever she now existed. And someday, I realized with a certainty that felt both thrilling and peaceful, it would be my turn to step into those margins. To become the patient guardian watching over the younger version of myself who is still learning how to navigate this strange and beautiful world. Story 8. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I descended the basement steps, basket of damp clothes clutched against my chest. Tuesday evening, 7:30 sharp. My routine as predictable as the mechanical wheeze of the old furnace in the corner. The concrete floor felt cold beneath my bare feet, each step echoing in the narrow space between water heater and washing machine. I'd lived in this house for 3 years now. Inherited from my grandmother, along with her collection of doilies, and the persistent smell of lavender that seemed to seep from the very walls. The basement had always been my least favorite part of the house. Too many shadows, too many corners where the light didn't quite reach. But laundry was laundry, and the machines down here worked better than any I could afford to replace. The dryer door opened with its usual metallic groan. I began feeding clothes into the drum, one piece at a time. Cotton t-shirts, denim jeans. The blue sweater I'd worn to work that morning. The fabric felt slightly damp still, carrying the clean scent of detergent mixed with something else. Something earthier, like soil after rain. As I reached for the dryer settings, I noticed something odd about the door's surface. The white enamel reflected the overhead light, but there seemed to be marks on it. Smudges, perhaps, or water spots that hadn't quite dried. I leaned closer, squinting in the harsh fluorescent glare. A face smiled back at me. Not my reflection. I wasn't smiling. This was something else. Etched into the condensation on the dryer's glass door, like a child's drawing on a fogged window. 2 curved lines for eyes, a simple arc for a mouth. Innocent enough, really. The kind of thing that could have been caused by random moisture patterns, by the way warm air had condensed and cooled. I wiped it away with my sleeve. The glass cleared, showing only my own tired face staring back. Work had been exhausting today. Budget meetings and performance reviews until my head pounded with numbers and corporate speak. Clearly, I was seeing things that weren't there. The dryer rumbled to life with the press of a button. I settled into the old folding chair my grandmother had kept down here, pulling out my phone to pass the time. The basement filled with the rhythmic tumbling of clothes, punctuated by the occasional thunk of a button or zipper hitting the drum's walls. 20 minutes in, I glanced up from my screen. The face was back. This time it was clearer, more defined. The same simple smile, but the condensation had formed in impossible detail. I could make out what looked like individual fingerprints pressed against the inside of the glass, as if someone had traced the features from within the machine itself. My heart began to beat faster. That familiar flutter of anxiety I'd been managing since the divorce. Dr. Martinez had warned me about stress manifesting in unusual ways. Hallucinations weren't uncommon during periods of major life change. Moving back to grandmother's house, starting over at 35, the isolation of living alone for the first time in decades. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting to 4 on each inhale, holding for 4, exhaling for 4. A simple grounding technique. The face was just moisture. Steam finding the path of least resistance, forming patterns that my tired brain interpreted as familiar shapes. But when I opened my eyes, the smile seemed wider. The dryer continued its mechanical dance, clothes tumbling in endless loops. I found myself listening more carefully to the rhythm, trying to distinguish between the normal sounds and something else. Was that whispering? The soft susurration of fabric against fabric, or something more deliberate? I stood up, moving closer to the machine. The face in the condensation watched me approach, its simple features somehow managing to convey a sense of anticipation. The glass felt warm under my palm when I pressed my hand against it, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I felt pressure pushing back from the other side. "This is ridiculous," I said aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the basement's confines. The sound came back to me altered somehow, as if it had bounced off surfaces that weren't quite where they should be. I wiped the glass clean again, this time more thoroughly. Streaks of water ran down the white enamel, and I watched them carefully, noting how they fell in random patterns, following the laws of gravity and surface tension. Nothing supernatural about condensation, nothing unusual about an overactive imagination processing stress through visual distortions. The clothes continued to tumble. Each rotation brought a soft thud as wet fabric hit the drum's sides, followed by the whisper of cotton sliding across metal. But gradually, I became aware of another sound beneath the mechanical noise. A soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingers drumming against glass. Tap, tap, tap. I pressed my ear closer to the dryer door, trying to isolate the sound. It seemed to be coming from inside the machine, but that was impossible. The drum was sealed except for the door, and I'd loaded it myself. Nothing in there but clothes and warm air and tap, 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 tap. The pattern was deliberate, almost like Morse code. My grandmother had known Morse code, had taught me a few letters when I was young. This sequence was simple enough: 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. But I couldn't remember what it meant, if it meant anything at all. When I pulled back from the machine, the face had returned to the glass. But this time it was different. More complex, more human. The simple lines had been joined by others curves that suggested cheekbones, dots that might have been nostrils, even what looked like individual eyelashes drawn in the finest threads of moisture. And it was looking directly at me. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven concrete floor. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. The fluorescent light above began to flicker, casting strange patterns on the walls. Patterns that seemed to shift and move, even when I wasn't looking directly at them. The tapping from inside the dryer grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was making the sound wasn't following the machine's rotation anymore. It came in bursts, urgent and demanding, like someone trapped inside trying to get out. I should have opened the door then. Should have stopped the cycle and checked inside, proved to myself that there was nothing there but warm clothes and my own overwrought nerves. Instead, I found myself backing toward the stairs, my rational mind warring with something deeper and more primitive. The face in the glass turned to follow my movement. That was impossible, of course. Condensation doesn't turn, doesn't track motion like eyes in a portrait. But I watched it happen anyway, watched as the simple features shifted position on the glass, maintaining their focus on me, even as I moved from one side of the basement to the other. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from my sister, called earlier, but no answer. "You okay? Call me back." I'd missed her call completely, lost in this strange fixation with the dryer. The timestamp showed it had come through an hour ago, but that couldn't be right. I'd only been down here for 30 minutes, maybe 40 at most. The cycle timer on the machine read 15 minutes remaining, exactly what it had shown when I'd last checked. Time felt elastic in the basement, stretching and contracting like warm taffy. The tapping from inside the dryer had evolved into something more complex now. Not random impacts, but a deliberate rhythm that seemed almost like language, almost like it was trying to communicate. I forced myself to approach the machine again. The face in the glass had grown more detailed still, acquiring subtleties I hadn't noticed before. There was something familiar about the features now, something that tugged at the edges of memory, like a word on the tip of my tongue. The eyes, if they could be called eyes, seemed sad now rather than menacing. The mouth had shifted from a simple smile to something more complex, more human. Almost as if whoever was creating these patterns was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated with each iteration. When I placed my palm against the glass again, the warmth was more intense. The surface vibrated slightly under my touch, and I could feel the rhythm of the tapping through the metal door. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. Over and over, patient and persistent. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling foolish even as the words left my lips. The tapping stopped in the sudden silence. I became aware of how loud my breathing had become, how fast my heart was beating. The fluorescent light continued its irregular flicker, and somewhere in the depths of the house above, a board creaked as the old structure settled into the night. Then, slowly, new patterns began to form in the condensation. Not a face this time, but letters. Crude at first, like a child's finger, writing on a steamed bathroom mirror, but growing clearer as I watched. H-E-L-P. The word hung there on the glass for a moment before the moisture shifted again, forming new letters beneath the first. M-E. I stared at the words, my mind racing through possible explanations. Optical illusions, pareidolia, stress-induced hallucinations, all more likely than what I seemed to be seeing. But the letters were too deliberate, too clear to dismiss as random patterns in condensation. Help you with what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The response came not in letters this time, but in images. The condensation swirled and reformed, creating shapes that seemed to tell a story. A figure, human-shaped but indistinct, standing in what might have been a room. Then the same figure lying down still, surrounded by darkness. And finally, the figure fading away entirely, leaving only empty space on the glass. My throat felt dry. The basement's air seemed thinner somehow, harder to breathe. I recognized the story the images were telling, even as my rational mind rebelled against the interpretation. The cycle timer now read 5 minutes remaining, but I could no longer trust what I was seeing. Time had become unreliable down here, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of the machine and the evolution of the face in the glass. I thought about my grandmother, who had lived in this house for 50 years, who had done laundry in this same basement, using these same machines, who had died 3 months before I inherited the house. Died alone, they said, peacefully in her sleep. But what if it hadn't been peaceful? What if she'd been down here, in the basement, when it happened? What if she'd been trying to get back upstairs, trying to call for help, but couldn't make it past the washing machines and the concrete floor, and the shadows that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day? The face in the glass had changed again. The features were sharper now, more defined, and with a shock that sent ice water through my veins, I realized why they seemed so familiar. They were my grandmother's features. Her kind eyes, her gentle smile, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she'd told me about 100 times. But aged beyond what I remembered, worn down by time, and whatever had happened to her in this basement. "Grandma," I whispered. The condensation shifted one final time, forming words that made my blood run cold. "I'm Stiela Shieri." The dryer buzzer rang, sharp and sudden in the basement silence. The cycle was complete. But as I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, I realized I was no longer sure what I would find inside. The clothes would be warm and dry and perfectly normal, I told myself, and the face in the glass would be gone, wiped away by the end of the cycle's heat. By morning, this would all seem like a strange dream, brought on by stress and isolation and too many late nights alone in a house full of memories. But as the buzzer continued to ring, urgent and mechanical, I found myself wondering, if I opened that door, would the clothes tumble out as expected? Or would something else emerge from the warm darkness? Something that had been waiting patiently for someone to finally hear its message. someone to finally understand that help was needed. My hand hovered over the door handle. The basement held its breath around me. Shadows gathering in corners where the fluorescent light couldn't reach. And in the sudden silence, after the buzzer stopped, I heard it again. The soft tapping from inside the machine, patient and persistent. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. SOS. I pulled my hand back from the door handle and slowly backed toward the stairs, leaving the dryer unopened, its contents still tumbling in darkness. Some loads of laundry, I realized, were never meant to be finished. Behind me, as I climbed the steps 2 at a time, I heard the tapping continue. And just before I reached the top and slammed the basement door behind me, I could have sworn I heard something else. A voice, soft and familiar, calling my name from inside the machine. But that, surely, was just my imagination. Story 9. The click of the latch should have been final. I pressed the door firmly into its frame, feeling the satisfying resistance as the mechanism engaged. The soft thud of wood meeting wood. The gentle whisper of the rubber seal compressing. These were the sounds of closure, of boundaries established, of the outside world held at bay. But as I turned away, the hinges whispered back. Creak. The sound came from behind me, slow and deliberate, like an old man stretching arthritic joints. I paused, my hand still reaching for the light switch, and listened. The apartment fell silent again, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the barely perceptible tick of the wall clock. I must have imagined it. The light switch clicked under my finger, and the hallway plunged into comfortable darkness. Through the thin gap beneath the door, I could see the pale yellow glow of the corridor lighting outside. It formed a perfect line of illumination, unbroken and steady. The door was closed. I padded barefoot toward the bedroom, my feet whispering against the hardwood floor. Each step produced a soft percussion, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The familiar sounds of my evening routine began to settle around me like a well-worn blanket. Creak. This time, I stopped completely. The sound had been longer, more pronounced, accompanied by the faintest whisper of moving air. I turned back toward the front door, and the line of light beneath it seemed different. Wider, perhaps. Or was it the same width, but somehow brighter? I approached slowly, my bare feet now conscious of every texture beneath them. The smooth planks of the hardwood, the slight give of the area rug, the cool transition back to wood as I drew closer to the entrance. The door appeared closed. The handle sat in its proper position, the deadbolt indicator showing locked, the security chain hanging in place. Everything exactly as I had left it mere moments before. Yet something felt wrong. The air near the door seemed cooler, carrying with it the faintest trace of the hallway's antiseptic scent, that peculiar mixture of industrial carpet cleaner and the lingering ghost of 100 different meals from 100 different apartments. I pressed my ear against the door, the painted wood cool against my skin. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of the building. The distant murmur of a television, the rhythmic thump of footsteps from the apartment above, the whisper of the elevator machinery somewhere in the walls. Normal sounds, comforting sounds, but underneath it all, almost below the threshold of hearing, there was something else. A presence, awaiting. I pulled back from the door and tested the handle. It turned slightly under my touch, just enough to confirm what I already knew. The door was unlatched. My memory of closing it remained vivid. The deliberate push, the satisfying click, the final check of the deadbolt. Yet here it was, hanging loose in its frame, held closed only by the subtle pressure of the spring hinges and perhaps the building's ventilation system. I pushed the door firmly shut again, this time paying careful attention to every sensation. The handle turned with its familiar resistance. The latch mechanism clicked into place with that distinctive metallic snap. The door settled into its frame with a soft thud that I felt as much as heard. I engaged the deadbolt, listening to its solid chunk as it slid home into the strike plate. For good measure, I fastened the security chain, its metal links chiming softly as they settled into position. The door was closed, locked, secured. I waited, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. The apartment remained quiet except for those familiar background sounds that had become the soundtrack to my solitude. 4, 5, 6. Kriiak. The sound seemed to emanate not from the hinges themselves, but from somewhere deeper within the door's structure, as if the wood itself was stretching, expanding, finding new ways to move despite the constraints I had placed upon it. I approached the door again, and this time there was no mistaking it. The gap beneath had widened. Not much, perhaps the width of a pencil, but enough to allow more of the hallway's light to seep in, enough to change the quality of air in the room. The deadbolt remained engaged. The chain hung in place. Yet somehow, impossibly, the door had opened. I stood there for a long moment, studying the contradiction before me. My rational mind catalogued possible explanations. Settling building foundations, causing the frame to shift. Changes in humidity affecting the wood's dimensions. A faulty latch mechanism that only appeared to engage properly. All reasonable, all logical. All insufficient to explain the growing certainty that something on the other side was waiting for me to give up, to walk away, to leave the door unwatched so it could continue whatever slow, patient work it had begun. I closed the door again. This time I remained beside it, my hand resting on the handle, feeling for any vibration, any subtle movement that might explain what was happening. The metal was cool under my palm, smooth and reassuring. Minutes passed. My breathing settled into a quiet rhythm. The building's nighttime sounds continued their familiar patterns around me. Then I felt it. A gentle pressure against my palm, not sudden or violent, but gradual and persistent, like a flower slowly opening to the morning sun. The handle was turning under my hand, so slowly that at first I convinced myself it was my imagination, a trick of nerves and fatigue. But the sensation continued, growing more pronounced. Something was turning the handle from the outside, applying steady, patient pressure against my grip. I could feel the mechanism's internal components shifting, the springs compressing, the latch beginning its slow withdrawal from the strike plate. I tightened my hold, pushing back against the invisible force. For a moment, we were locked in a gentle contest of wills, myself on the inside, holding fast, and whatever presence lurked in the hallway, applying its relentless pressure from without. The sensation was almost intimate in its quietness. No violent rattling, no angry demands for entry. Just this soft, persistent testing of my resolve, as patient as erosion, as inevitable as tide. My arm began to ache from the sustained tension. Sweat gathered in the creases of my palm, making my grip less certain. The metal of the handle had warmed under my touch, taking on the temperature of my skin until I could no longer distinguish where my hand ended and the mechanism began. Still, the pressure continued. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, trying to calm the growing anxiety that whispered along my spine. This was my apartment, my door, my lock. Whatever was happening had a rational explanation, and if I could just think clearly, I would find it. But when I opened my eyes again, the gap beneath the door had widened further. The deadbolt remained locked. I could see its red indicator glowing like a tiny ember in the darkness. The chain still hung in place, its links catching the hall light and throwing small, sharp shadows against the wall. Yet the door had somehow moved away from its frame, creating a space wide enough now for me to slide my fingers through if I had been so inclined, which I was not. The cool air from the hallway flowed more freely now, carrying with it new scents and sounds. I caught the faint aroma of coffee from someone's late night brewing, the whisper of pages turning as an insomniac neighbor read past midnight, the distant sigh of the building's heating system cycling on. And underneath it all, so quiet I might have imagined it, the sound of breathing that was not my own. I released the handle and stepped back, my heart now beating fast enough that I could hear it pulsing in my ears. The door remained in its impossible state, locked but open, secured but accessible, closed but welcoming whatever waited in the hall to slip inside. I tried to remember if this had ever happened before. Surely I would recall such a strange occurrence. Yet as I searched my memory, I found only fragments half, remembered moments of waking in the night to check locks. Vague impressions of doors that seemed different in the morning than they had the evening before. The persistent feeling that my home was somehow more permeable than it should be. Had I always lived with this uncertainty? This sense that my boundaries were more suggestion than fact? Or was this the beginning of something new? Something that would grow with each passing night until the very concept of inside and outside lost all meaning. I approached the door once more, drawn by a mixture of fascination and dread. The gap beneath it had stabilized no wider than before, but no narrower either. Through that space, I could see a thin slice of the hallway carpet, beige and industrial, worn smooth by countless footsteps. As I watched, a shadow passed across that narrow view. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone were walking back and forth just outside my door. The shadow was dark against the carpet's pale surface, roughly the size and shape of a human foot. But something about its movement was wrong, too measured, too patient, too aware of being observed. I pressed my face closer to the door, trying to get a better view through the gap. The shadow paused directly in front of the opening, and for a moment I had the unsettling impression that whatever cast it was crouching down, positioning itself to peer back at me through that thin space. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool air flowing under the door. I pulled back quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I couldn't resist looking again. The shadow was still there, motionless now, perfectly aligned with the gap. Waiting. I found myself wondering what would happen if I were to unlock the door completely, to remove the deadbolt and unhook the chain. to swing it wide and confront whatever presence had been playing this patient game with me. Would I find a neighbor, confused and concerned about strange sounds from my apartment? Would I discover some perfectly innocent explanation for the shadow, the breathing, the persistent opening of a door that should have stayed closed? Or would I find something else entirely, something that had been waiting for just such an invitation? Something that understood the difference between the locked and the merely closed. Something that respected boundaries only until they were freely abandoned. My hand moved toward the deadbolt before I caught myself. Whatever was out there had been patient enough to work around my locks, gentle enough to avoid triggering my conscious defenses, clever enough to make me question my own perceptions. It could wait a little longer. I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes fixed on that tellingly gap. The shadow remained motionless, a dark presence just beyond the threshold of my sanctuary, in my bedroom. I lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while I listened to the sounds of my apartment. The familiar hums and clicks had taken on new significance now. Each creak of settling wood, each whisper of air through the vents, each distant sound from the building around me, all of it could be something else, something other, something that had found its way past boundaries I had thought secure. But it was the silence that worried me most. The absence of that soft creaking sound, the lack of any indication that the door continued its slow, patient work. Silence meant that whatever was happening had either stopped or moved beyond my ability to perceive it. Neither possibility offered much comfort. As the night deepened around me, I found myself wondering if this was how it would always be now, this uncertainty about the spaces I inhabited. This question about the reliability of locks and doors and walls. Perhaps the boundaries had always been more porous than I had imagined. Perhaps I was only now becoming aware of something that had been true all along. The thought followed me toward sleep. Even as I remained listening for the soft creak of hinges, the whisper of moving air, the gentle sound of something patient finally running out of patience. In my dreams, doors opened and closed with minds of their own, revealing hallways that stretched far beyond the dimensions of any building I had ever known. And in those dreams, I walked barefoot through corridors that breathed with their own rhythm, past doors that watched my passage with invisible eyes, toward some destination that remained always just around the next corner, just through the next doorway, just beyond the next threshold I had never meant to cross. When I woke the next morning, the door was closed. The deadbolt remained engaged. The chain still hung in place, and the gap beneath showed only the expected thin line of hallway light. But on the hardwood floor, just inside the threshold, was a small puddle of water that hadn't been there the night before. It was perfectly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, and it reflected the morning light streaming through my windows like a mirror set into the wood. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how water had appeared on the inside of my locked apartment. There were no leaks in the ceiling above, no pipes running through that section of the floor, no windows nearby that might have allowed rain to enter. Just a circle of clear water, sitting patiently inside my closed door, waiting for me to notice it, to acknowledge it, to accept that some boundaries were more permeable than others. I cleaned it up with a towel, watching as the fabric absorbed the liquid and the wood beneath returned to its normal, dry state. But throughout the day, as I went about my routine, I found myself glancing back at that spot, expecting to see the water return, waiting for the next sign that my understanding of closed doors and locked spaces was far more fragile than I had ever imagined. Tonight, I know, the door will try to open again. And tonight, I'm not sure I'll have the strength to keep it closed. Story 10. The notification had arrived at 3:47 p.m., the cheerful chime of my phone cutting through the afternoon quiet of my apartment. Package delivered, it announced with algorithmic certainty. Left by front door. I hadn't been expecting anything. Still, deliveries were frequent enough in my building that I thought little of it. Perhaps a neighbor's package had been misdelivered, or maybe I had forgotten about some online purchase made during a late night bout of insomnia-induced shopping. These things happened. But when I opened my door 20 minutes later, the box that waited on my welcome mat was unlike anything I had ever ordered. It was perfectly ordinary, in most respects brown cardboard, roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with the ubiquitous brown packing tape that held together the commerce of the modern world. The shipping label was crisp and clear, printed with that slightly fuzzy quality of thermal printers that had become the universal signature of online retail. What made it extraordinary was the name in the address field, my name, spelled exactly as I spelled it, complete with the unusual middle initial that appeared on only the most official documents. Below that, my address, formatted with the same precision I used when filling out forms. The return address was blank except for a single line of text. From you. I crouched beside the box, studying the label more carefully. The tracking number was a string of digits and letters that meant nothing to me. But the shipping date was yesterday, a Tuesday that I remembered clearly for its complete lack of online purchases. The delivery service logo was familiar, one of the major carriers that serviced the building regularly. Everything about the package appeared legitimate, except for the impossible return address and the fact that I had no memory of sending it. I carried it inside, setting it on my kitchen table where the afternoon light streaming through the windows could illuminate every detail. The cardboard was standard weight, neither flimsy nor exceptionally sturdy. The tape showed no signs of tampering, no evidence that it had been opened and resealed. The weight was puzzling light enough to suggest emptiness, but with a subtle shifting sensation when I tilted it, as if something small moved freely inside. A gentle shake produced no sound. I found myself reluctant to open it, though I couldn't articulate why. There was something about the neat handwriting of my own name, the precision of my own address, the simple statement, "From you," that felt like a violation of some fundamental rule about cause and effect, about the linear progression of actions and consequences. But curiosity eventually overcame caution, as it always does. The tape peeled away cleanly, leaving no residue on the cardboard. The flaps opened with the soft rustle of corrugated material flexing along predetermined creases. Inside, nestled in a bed of white packing peanuts, was nothing. Or rather, nothing visible. The box contained only the foam packing material, arranged with the kind of care typically reserved for protecting fragile items during shipping. I pushed aside the peanuts, running my fingers along the bottom and sides of the container, searching for some small object that might explain the shifting weight I had felt earlier. There was nothing to find, but as I lifted the box to examine it more closely, I caught a scent that made me pause. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but unmistakably familiar. The smell was complex, part soap, part laundry detergent, part something uniquely personal that I associated with my own belongings. It was the scent of my apartment, my clothes, my life, somehow contained within cardboard walls and packing material. I set the box down and stepped back, trying to process this latest impossibility. The package smelled like me, like my space, as if it had been packed not in some distant warehouse, but here in my own home. But that made no sense. I would remember packing a box. I would remember scheduling a pickup. I would remember the entire process of sending something to myself. Unless I had forgotten. The thought brought with it a wave of unease that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Memory was imperfect, after all. Everyone forgot things. But this felt different, not like forgetting where I had put my keys, or whether I had locked the door, but like discovering a gap in my own life. A space where activity had occurred without my conscious participation. I examined the packing peanuts more carefully, lifting them one by one and studying them for any clue about their origin. They were standard polystyrene foam, the kind used by thousands of shipping companies worldwide. Nothing distinctive about their shape or color. Nothing to indicate where they had come from or who had placed them in the box. But as I handled them, I noticed something peculiar. Each peanut was slightly warm to the touch, as if it had recently been held by someone else. The warmth was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to pulse gently against my fingertips, like a very slow heartbeat. I dropped the peanuts back into the box and backed away from the table. The entire situation was becoming surreal in a way that my rational mind struggled to process. Empty packages didn't generate their own heat. Packing materials didn't retain body warmth for hours after being handled, and I certainly didn't send mysterious shipments to myself with return addresses that defied logic. Yet here was evidence of all three impossibilities. Sitting on my kitchen table like a puzzle box, designed by someone with an intimate knowledge of my daily routines, and an agenda I couldn't begin to fathom. I decided to approach this methodically. If I had somehow sent this package to myself during some forgotten episode, there would be evidence. Credit card charges, email confirmations, browser history, the digital breadcrumbs that marked every transaction in the modern world. My laptop revealed nothing. No recent purchases from any shipping company, no scheduled pickups, no emails confirming delivery services. My credit card statements showed only the usual array of mundane expenses, groceries, utilities. The subscription services that had become the background hum of contemporary existence. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, something else caught my attention. 3 days ago, there had been a charge I didn't remember making. It was small, less than $10 from a company whose name I didn't recognize. When I clicked on the merchant details, I found only a generic description: packaging services. The charge had been processed at 3:47 a.m., a time when I was normally asleep. But when I tried to remember that particular night, I found my recollection strangely fuzzy. I could remember going to bed at my usual time, and I could remember waking up the next morning. But the hours in between were wrapped in an unusual haze, as if I had been dreaming more vividly than usual, and the dreams had somehow displaced my ordinary memories. I returned to the kitchen, where the box waited with patient malevolence. The packing peanuts had settled slightly, and I could now see that they weren't randomly arranged. There was a pattern to their distribution, a deliberate organization that suggested they had been placed with care rather than simply poured in. Looking more closely, I realized they formed a rough outline, the shape of something that was no longer there, like the impression left in soil after an object has been removed. The outline was approximately 6 inches long and 3 inches wide, with rounded corners that suggested a book or a journal. Had there been something in the box originally? Had I sent myself an object that had somehow disappeared between packing and delivery? Or had the entire purpose been to create this negative space, this absence that would make me wonder what should have been there? I photographed the arrangement with my phone, zooming in to capture the precise positioning of each foam peanut. As I reviewed the images, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. In the high-resolution photo, barely visible among the white foam, were small dark specks. They could have been dust or debris picked up during shipping, but when I enlarged the image, they resolved into something far more unsettling. They were letters. Individual letters of the alphabet, printed in tiny font on what appeared to be fragments of paper, scattered throughout the packing material like confetti from a celebration I couldn't remember attending. I emptied the box completely, shaking out every peanut and examining each one under the bright LED light of my desk lamp. Sure enough, dozens of paper fragments were mixed in with the foam, each bearing a single letter in what looked like standard computer printout font. It took me nearly an hour to collect all the pieces and arrange them on my dining room table. There were 47 fragments in total, and as I tried various combinations and arrangements, a message began to emerge. D-O-O-U-R-M-E-M-B-R-O-E-Y-U-F-A-R-G-O-G-O-F-A-R-G-T. The question hit me with an impact that was almost physical. I stared at the assembled letters, my vision blurring slightly as the words seemed to pulse with their own significance. What had I forgotten to forget? And why was I asking myself this question through such an elaborate and impossible delivery method? I swept the letters into a pile and dumped them back into the box, suddenly desperate to be rid of the entire mystery. But as I reached for the lid to close it, something stopped me. A sound, so faint I might have imagined it, was coming from inside the container. Breathing. Not my own breathing, which had become quick and shallow as my anxiety mounted, but something else. Something that matched the rhythm of sleep, slow and deep and peaceful, as if someone were dreaming inside the cardboard walls. I leaned closer, straining to hear. The sound was definitely there, soft but unmistakable, accompanied by the barely perceptible movement of air. The box was breathing, and the breath smelled like my own, the same combination of coffee and toothpaste, and the faint staleness that comes from spending too much time indoors. I sealed the box quickly, pressing the flaps down and reaching for the roll of tape I kept in my utility drawer. But as I began to secure the lid, I realized that my hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from something deeper, a recognition that seemed to come from somewhere below conscious thought. I had done this before. The knowledge arrived without supporting memories, but with absolute certainty. I had packed this box before, arranged these peanuts, scattered these letters, sealed this container with my own hands during some period of my life that had been edited out of my conscious recollection. But if I had packed it, what had I put inside? What was missing now that had been there when I originally prepared the shipment? The answer came to me as I pressed the final strip of tape into place myself. I had put myself in the box, not literally, but some part of myself that I had wanted to preserve, to send forward through time, to deliver to a future version of myself who might need whatever I had tried to save. And now it was gone. The breathing had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of absence, the weight of something that should have been there, but wasn't. I carried the resealed box to my bedroom and placed it on the shelf in my closet, next to old photo albums and boxes of documents I rarely accessed. But I couldn't leave it alone. Over the following days, I found myself returning to the closet, pressing my ear against the cardboard, listening for any sign that whatever I had lost might return. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers, conversations in my own voice, discussing topics I couldn't quite make out. Other times, there were sounds that might have been pages turning, as if someone inside was reading a book I had written but never remembered writing. A week later, another notification arrived on my phone. Package delivered, left by front door. This time, I didn't wait 20 minutes. I opened the door immediately and found another box, identical to the first except for the return address, which now read, "From who you used to be." Inside this box, among the familiar white peanuts, I found a journal I had never seen before, filled with entries written in my own handwriting. The dates spanned the past year, documenting experiences I couldn't remember having, thoughts I didn't remember thinking, dreams I had never had but somehow recognized as my own. The final entry was dated yesterday. "I'm sending this back to you because you need to remember what you chose to forget. The boxes will keep coming until you find what you put in the first one. Check your dreams tonight. Check the spaces between sleeping and waking. Check the moments when you're sure you're alone, but feel like someone is watching. You package yourself away for safekeeping, but safe from what? And why can't you remember deciding to do it? The return address on the next box will be from who you're going to be. Open it carefully. Some futures are more fragile than others." I closed the journal and looked around my apartment with new eyes. How many other versions of myself had been here, packing boxes, writing letters, preparing shipments for a future that was now my present? How many times had I discovered these packages and forgotten about them again, caught in some loop of memory and forgetting that kept me from understanding what I was trying to tell myself? The next morning, another notification arrived, but this time, when I opened the door, I found not a box but a mirror propped against my doorframe, reflecting back an image of myself that seemed somehow unfamiliar despite being undeniably me. And written in the condensation on the mirror's surface, in what looked like my own handwriting, were the words, "Ready to come home." I reached out to touch the glass, and my reflection reached back. But for just a moment before our fingers met, I could swear that the person in the mirror smiled before I did, moved before I moved, knew something I had not yet learned about the nature of packages that deliver themselves and the cargo they carry across the impossible distances between who we were, who we are, and who we're trying to become. The mirror was still there when I closed the door, but my reflection had changed. Now it showed me holding a box I didn't remember picking up, preparing to pack something I couldn't see, addressing it to someone who might or might not be me. And in that reflection, I finally understood what I had forgotten to forget. The moment when I decided that the only safe place to store myself was somewhere I couldn't accidentally find me. In a box that would only open when I was ready to remember why I had needed to disappear in the first place. Tonight, I know. I will dream of cardboard and packing tape, of return addresses that lead nowhere and everywhere, of the sound of my own breathing echoing from containers that hold everything and nothing at all. And tomorrow, there will be another notification, another delivery, another chance to unwrap the mystery of who I am and why I keep sending myself messages I'm not ready to understand. The boxes will keep coming until I find what I put in the first one. But what if what I put in the first one was the ability to stop receiving them? What if the empty box was never meant to hold anything except the space where my certainty used to be? Story 11. The North Point Mall escalator to the third floor had been making that sound for months, a rhythmic clicking that suggested something loose in the mechanism, a bearing worn thin or a belt slightly askew. As the mall's evening maintenance supervisor, I'd reported it dozens of times, but the repair never seemed to make it to the top of anyone's priority list. It's not a safety issue, the day manager kept telling me. Just cosmetic noise. We'll get to it when the budget allows. But I knew that escalator better than anyone. I'd been working at North Point for 8 years, and I'd ridden that particular escalator thousands of times during routine inspections, emergency calls, and the countless small tasks that filled my 10-hour shifts. I knew its normal sounds, its typical vibrations, the way it shuddered slightly when someone heavy stepped on near the top. This clicking was new, and it was getting worse. On Tuesday night, 3 weeks into October, I decided to investigate properly. The mall had been closed for 2 hours. The last stragglers from the food court had finally departed, and the security guards were settled into their evening routine of checking locks and monitoring cameras. It was the perfect time for maintenance work, quiet, uninterrupted, with no risk of inconveniencing customers. I approached the escalator from the second floor, toolkit in hand, planning to ride it up to the third floor and then shut it down for inspection. The clicking was immediately audible, even over the ambient hum of the mall's HVAC system. But as I stepped onto the moving stairway, I noticed something odd about the sound's rhythm. It wasn't mechanical. It was too regular, too purposeful, like someone tapping their fingers on a desk or footsteps on a distant staircase. Click, click, click. Each sound corresponded exactly with my upward movement, as if the escalator was counting my progress step by step. I pulled out my phone and started a voice memo, thinking I might need to describe the problem more specifically to the repair company. Tuesday, October 15th, 11:20 p.m. Escalator from 2nd to 3rd floor, North Point Mall. Investigating intermittent clicking sound. Frequency appears to match. I looked up toward the 3rd floor landing, expecting to see the familiar sight of the cosmetics department's closed gates and darkened displays. But instead of the usual 20-second ride to the top, I seemed to still be climbing. The escalator steps continued moving beneath my feet, carrying me steadily upward, but the 3rd floor remained tantalizingly out of reach. I checked my watch. 30 seconds had passed. Then 45. Then a full minute. This isn't right, I muttered into the phone, still recording. The escalator should have reached the 3rd floor by now. I'm still moving upward, but I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The 2nd floor was definitely behind me. I could see the familiar railing and storefronts receding into the distance below. But above me, the escalator continued its steady climb toward a destination that seemed to move away as fast as I approached it. The clicking continued, perfectly timed with my ascent. Click, click, click. I tried stepping backward, thinking I might be able to walk down the escalator while it carried me up, effectively staying in place. But when I lifted my foot to take a step down, I found I couldn't. Not because anything was holding me, but because the motion felt fundamentally wrong, like trying to breathe underwater or blink with my ears. My body understood, even if my mind didn't. I was meant to go up, only up. Okay, I said aloud, trying to keep my voice calm for the recording. Some kind of malfunction. The escalator isn't stopping at the 3rd floor. I need to. I reached for the emergency stop button on the side panel, but my hand passed through it as if it were made of light. I need to wall. What did I need to do? The rational part of my mind suggested calling security, but my radio was clipped to my belt, and when I reached for it, my hand encountered only empty space. My keys were gone too, and my badge, and everything else that should have been there. Everything except my phone, which was still faithfully recording my increasingly panicked observations. The escalator is malfunctioning, I said into the device, though I was no longer sure who I was talking to. I can't get off. I can't reach the emergency stop. I've been riding for... I checked the timestamp on my recording. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. This should be physically impossible. But even as I spoke, I could feel my certainty wavering. Was it really 4 minutes? The numbers on my phone seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them, like reading in a dream. Time felt elastic here, unreliable. The clicking continued its steady rhythm. Click, click, click. I looked down at the steps beneath my feet. They appeared normal, the same brushed metal surface, the same yellow safety strips along the edges, the same slight wear patterns I'd memorized over years of inspections. But when I tried to count them, to establish some sense of progress or position, the numbers kept slipping away from me. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. I'm going in circles, I whispered. Or not circles. The same steps are cycling past me, but I'm still going up. That's impossible. Unless the escalator had somehow become longer than itself. Unless space was behaving differently here than it did in the rest of the mall. Unless I had stepped out of the normal world and into something else entirely. I tried looking over the railing to get a better sense of my position. Below me, I could see the second floor clearly, the jewelry store with its security gates down, the bookstore with its closed sign, the pretzel stand with its chairs stacked on tables. Everything looked normal, exactly as I'd left it when I started this ride, but the distance seemed wrong. I should have been maybe 20 feet above the second floor, looking down at a manageable drop. Instead, the floor below appeared to be hundreds of feet away, as if I were ascending the inside of a skyscraper rather than moving between floors of a 3-story mall. And when I looked up, hoping to see the third floor approaching, there was only more escalator stretching into a darkness that seemed to swallow the overhead lighting. The clicking sound was getting louder. Or maybe I was just becoming more sensitive to it. Each click seemed to resonate through the metal structure now, vibrating up through my feet and into my bones. Click, click, click. Someone will notice I'm missing, I said into the phone, though I was no longer sure I was still recording. The screen showed my voice memo app, but the waveform looked wrong, too regular, too geometric, like a heartbeat on a medical monitor. My shift ends at 7 a.m. When I don't show up for my next shift, they'll come looking. But would they? I tried to remember if anyone had seen me enter the escalator, if I'd mentioned my maintenance plan to any of the security guards. My memory of the evening felt strangely hazy, like trying to recall a conversation from months ago. Had I even started my shift tonight? Had I actually been at work? Or had I simply found myself on this escalator, moving upward toward a destination that kept receding like a mirage? The more I tried to remember, the less certain I became. The details of my life outside this escalator, my apartment, my car, my routine felt increasingly distant and unreal. What felt real was the steady movement beneath my feet, the rhythmic clicking, the gradual ascent through space that defied logic. Click, 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 click. I tried a different approach. If I couldn't get off the escalator, maybe I could understand it. I knelt down and examined the moving steps more closely, looking for clues about the mechanism's malfunction. But when I tried to touch the metal's surface, my fingers passed through it like it was made of water. "I'm not really here," I said, and the words felt both terrifying and liberating. Or I'm here, but not in the same way the escalator is here. We're existing in different dimensions, phases. The idea should have been absurd, but it made a strange kind of sense. I could see the escalator, hear it, feel its movement carrying me upward. But I couldn't interact with it physically, couldn't affect or be affected by anything except its primary function, the relentless upward journey. I was a passenger, not a person. A consciousness carried along by forces beyond my control or understanding. The realization brought with it an unexpected calm. If I couldn't change my situation, if I couldn't get off or stop or turn around, then all I could do was observe, accept, experience whatever this was without fighting against it. The clicking began to change. Subtle at first, the rhythm remained the same, but the tone became richer, more musical, as if the escalator was learning to sing. Click, 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 clink, 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 chime.
Chime.
"It's beautiful," I said, surprised by my own reaction. "Whatever this is, it's becoming beautiful." I looked around with fresh eyes, no longer searching for escape, but simply taking in the experience. The escalator's handrails were glowing now with a soft, internal light. The steps beneath my feet had become translucent, revealing intricate mechanisms that pulsed and flowed like organic systems. Above me, the darkness was receding, replaced by a vista of stars that seemed impossibly close. "I understand now," I said into my phone, though I realized the device had become something else entirely, not a recording tool, but a conduit for communication with someone. Something. This isn't a malfunction. This is what the escalator was always supposed to do. The voice that answered came from everywhere and nowhere, like sound carried through water. "Yes, but why me? Why tonight? You were ready. You've been preparing for this journey without knowing it. Every night, every inspection, every time you rode this escalator and felt that moment of weightless transition between floors, you were learning to let go." I thought about my life at the mall, 8 years of routine maintenance, of fixing things that broke, of maintaining the illusion that everything was stable and predictable. Had I been happy? Had I been fulfilled? Or had I simply been waiting, unconsciously, for something to carry me away from the endless repetition of days? Where am I going? Always up, to the place where all journeys end and begin. The stars above were getting brighter, closer. I could see now that they weren't stars at all, but lights from windows, thousands of windows in buildings that stretched impossibly high into a sky that had no limit. And in each window, I glimpsed a life in progress. Someone cooking dinner, someone reading a book, someone sleeping, someone dancing, someone crying, someone laughing. All of them riding their own escalators, moving toward their own inevitable destinations. Will I see them? The other passengers? Eventually. When you reach the floor you're meant to reach. When you're ready to step off and step on again. Somewhere else. Someone else. The clicking had become a symphony now, not just my escalator, but dozens of them, hundreds, all carrying their passengers upward in perfect synchronization. I could hear the other riders too, their voices joining mine in a chorus of recognition and acceptance. "I'm not afraid anymore," I said. Fear was never necessary. Only trust. Only willingness to go where you're taken. My phone buzzed with a notification, a text message from someone whose name I couldn't quite read. The words were simple. "Are you almost home?" I looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Yes, almost." The escalator began to accelerate. Not mechanically, I felt no change in the physical sensation of movement, but temporally. The lights in the windows were flashing by faster now, lives compressed into moments, stories told in the space between heartbeats. I was approaching something. Not the third floor of North Point Mall that had never been my real destination. I was approaching the place where all the escalators converged, where all the journeys intersected, where every passenger eventually arrived. "Will I remember this?" I asked. "You'll remember everything. All of it. Every life you've lived, every escalator you've ridden, every time you've made this same journey to the same impossible destination. I've done this before, countless times, and you'll do it again. But the escalator always brings you back to where you started, but you arrive different each time, carrying new understanding, new perspective, new compassion." I could see the landing now, not a floor in a mall, but a platform suspended in space. surrounded by the warm light from all those windows. Other passengers were waiting there, people I recognized without remembering, faces that felt like home. "Thank you," I said to the escalator, to the voice, to whatever force had carried me here. "Thank you," it replied, "for trusting the journey." I stepped off the escalator onto the platform, my feet solid on the ground for the first time in hours. Days. Years. Time had no meaning here, only sequence, only the order in which things must happen. Behind me, the escalator continued its patient ascent, ready for the next passenger who would step on expecting to travel from the second floor to the third floor of a shopping mall, and who would instead discover that some journeys take you exactly where you need to go, even when you don't know where that is. I turned to wave goodbye, but the escalator was already gone. In its place was another one, heading down, and I understood that this too was part of the cycle. Somewhere below, in a mall or an office building or a subway station, someone was about to step onto what they thought was ordinary infrastructure and discover that nothing in the universe is truly ordinary. The clicking followed them as they began their descent. Click, 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 click. And in that sound, I heard the heartbeat of everything that moves between one place and another, everything that carries us from who we were to who we're becoming, everything that never stops, never breaks down, never needs repair. Only trust, only willingness, only the courage to keep moving when you can't see the destination. I walked away from the platform into the warm light of 1,000 windows, carrying with me the rhythm that would guide me until it was time to ride again. A story 12. The rain began as I walked home from the library, fat drops that splashed against the sidewalk with the promise of a proper downpour. I quickened my pace, clutching the stack of books against my chest, their plastic covers slick under my fingertips. The street lamps had just flickered on, casting yellow pools of light that rippled with each fresh wave of precipitation. I'd always loved the rain, found something soothing in its steady rhythm against windows and rooftops. But tonight felt different, heavier somehow, as if the clouds carried more than just water. The air tasted metallic, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my jacket. 3 blocks from home, the drizzle became a deluge. I ducked under the narrow awning of a closed coffee shop, water streaming from my hair and running down my face. The books were still dry, thankfully, protected by their plastic sleeves and my body's shelter. But my jacket was soaked through, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in as many seconds. That's when I noticed the phone booth. It stood on the corner across the street, an anachronism from another era, its glass panels glowing pale yellow in the streetlight. I'd walked this route hundreds of times over the past year since moving to this neighborhood, but I couldn't remember ever seeing a phone booth there before. The city had removed most of them years ago, victims of the cellular revolution. Yet there it was, solid and real, and somehow out of place in the modern landscape of LED signs and digital displays. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see a figure inside. They stood with their back to the street, perfectly still despite the storm raging around them. The phone booth offered complete shelter. Not a drop of water seemed to penetrate its sealed interior. The figure appeared to be using the phone, though something about their posture seemed wrong, too rigid, too unnatural for casual conversation. Lightning split the sky, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around me. In that brief moment of electric illumination, I saw the figure more clearly. They were wearing what looked like a dark coat, possibly wool, and their hair appeared to be light-colored, though the glass made it difficult to be certain. The awning above me provided poor protection, and water was beginning to drip through a tear in the fabric, landing steadily on my shoulder. I needed to move, needed to find better shelter, or simply make a run for home. But something about the phone booth held my attention, drew my gaze back, despite my rational mind's insistence that I should focus on getting out of the rain. The figure hadn't moved at all. I watched for several minutes, counting the seconds between lightning flashes, but the person inside remained motionless. They weren't gesticulating as people do during phone conversations, weren't shifting their weight or adjusting their grip on the receiver. They simply stood there, statue, still, facing the back wall of the booth. Perhaps the phone was broken, I thought. Maybe they were waiting for a dial tone or trying to figure out how the ancient coin mechanism worked. When was the last time I'd used a payphone myself? College, probably. Calling home when my dormitory's phone system went down during a particularly bad storm. That was 15 years ago, maybe 20. The rain showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. The drops now came at sharp angles, driven by gusts of wind that sent debris tumbling down the empty street. I would have to make a choice, soon brave the weather or find better shelter. That's when the figure in the phone booth turned slightly, just enough to present their profile to my vantage point. Even through the distortion of rain, covered glass and poor lighting, I could see that something was wrong. The profile was too flat, too undefined, as if I were looking at a paper cutout rather than a three-dimensional person. And the way they held the phone, pressed against their ear, but at an angle that seemed anatomically impossible. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through my clothes. I stepped back under the awning, pressing my spine against the coffee shop's locked door. The books in my arms felt heavier suddenly, their weight a comfort against the strange unease spreading through my chest. The figure turned back to face the rear of the phone booth, resuming their previous position. But now I noticed something I'd missed before. There was no phone cord visible. The old payphones had always been tethered to the booth by heavy, coiled cables that could stretch just far enough to allow some movement. But the space inside the booth appeared to be completely clear. Perhaps it was a newer model, I reasoned, with the cord routed through the wall or ceiling where I couldn't see it. Or maybe the cable was simply obscured by the figure's body and the poor visibility conditions. There had to be a logical explanation, but as I watched, trying to pierce the veil of rain and shadow, I began to notice other details that seemed off. The figure's breathing, for instance, or rather, the complete absence of it. Even in the cold, damp air, there should have been some condensation visible when they exhaled, some fog on the glass panels surrounding them. But the interior of the phone booth remained perfectly clear, and their stillness was becoming more unnerving the longer I observed it. Real people fidget, shift their weight. make small unconscious movements even when they're trying to stand still. This figure displayed none of these human quirks. They might have been carved from stone. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. And in its stark illumination, I saw something that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. The figure's reflection was wrong, distorted in a way that couldn't be explained by the wet glass or the angle of the streetlight. Where their head should have been reflected in the opposite panel, there was only empty space. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. The rain was making everything look strange, refracting light in unusual ways, and I was tired. I'd spent the entire afternoon researching for my thesis, poring over dusty volumes of local history until my eyes burned from strain. When I looked again, the reflection seemed normal, or at least no more distorted than could be expected under the circumstances. The figure remained in their previous position, phone pressed to their ear, facing away from the street, facing away from me. But now I was certain they knew I was watching. I couldn't say what gave me this impression. There was no visible acknowledgement, no gesture or movement that indicated awareness of my presence. It was something more subtle, a tension in their posture perhaps, or the way they seemed to be listening to more than just whatever voice might be coming through the phone receiver. The smart thing to do would be to leave, to make a run through the rain and get home to my warm apartment, where I could dry off and convince myself that this was nothing more than an overactive imagination combined with poor weather and insufficient lighting. But I found myself rooted in place, transfixed by the strange tableau across the street. How long had they been in there? I tried to remember if I'd seen the figure when I first ducked under the awning, but the sequence of events was becoming muddled in my memory. Had they been there when I arrived, or had they entered the booth while I was focused on protecting my books from the rain? The phone booth itself seemed wrong now that I studied it more carefully. The design was too clean, too modern for something that should have been decades old. The glass panels showed no signs of wear or weather damage, no scratches or chips that would be expected from years of urban exposure. Even the metal frame gleamed as if it had just been installed. And where were the graffiti, the accumulated stickers and scratches that seemed to materialize on every public surface in the city? This phone booth looked pristine, untouched by human contact except for the solitary figure currently occupying it. A new thought occurred to me, one that sent a fresh wave of unease through my already churning stomach. What if this wasn't a real phone booth at all? What if it was some kind of art installation, a piece of performance art designed to confuse and unsettle passersby? That would explain the figure's unnatural stillness, their strange posture, and lack of visible breathing. But even as I considered this possibility, I knew it didn't feel right. There was something genuinely unsettling about the scene, something that went beyond mere artistic provocation. The air around the phone booth seemed different, thicker, more charged, as if reality itself was slightly bent in its vicinity. I pulled out my phone, thinking I might take a picture, capture some evidence of this strange encounter. But when I raised the device and looked through its camera, the phone booth appeared completely empty. The glass panels were there, clearly visible in the LED flash, but no figure stood inside. I lowered the phone and looked directly across the street. The figure was still there, still motionless, still facing away from me. Raised the phone again. Empty booth. My hands began to shake, and it wasn't from the cold rain soaking through my jacket. This was beyond strange weather or tired eyes or artistic installations. This was something else entirely. Something that challenged the basic assumptions I'd made about how the world worked. The figure in the booth, if it was a figure, hadn't moved in all the time I'd been watching. But now, as I stood there with my phone in my hand, debating whether to approach or flee, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Ringing. The sound came from across the street, muffled by distance and the steady patter of rain, but unmistakable. An old-fashioned telephone ring, mechanical and insistent. The kind of sound payphones used to make when someone was calling in. But who would call a random payphone in the middle of a thunderstorm? And how would they even know the number? The ringing continued, echoing off the wet pavement and empty storefronts. 4 rings, 5, 6. The figure in the booth made no move to answer, simply maintained their impossible stillness as the phone demanded attention. On the 7th ring, the sound stopped. In the sudden silence, broken only by the rain's steady percussion, I heard something else. Footsteps slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting to see another pedestrian seeking shelter from the storm. But the sidewalk was empty in both directions. The sound continued for a few more steps, then faded into the ambient noise of the rain. When I looked back at the phone booth, the figure had changed position. They were still facing away from me, still holding what appeared to be a phone receiver, but now they stood closer to the glass panel that faced the street. Close enough that their breath should have been fogging the surface, should have left some trace of their presence on the cold glass. The panel remained perfectly clear. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, moving to the edge of the awning's protection. Rain immediately began to soak through my hair again, but I needed a better angle, needed to see more clearly what was happening across the street. From this new position, I could see that the figure was wearing a long coat, as I'd thought earlier, but the fabric seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And their hair, what I'd taken for light-colored hair, now appeared to be something else entirely. Something that moved with its own rhythm, independent of the still air inside the booth. The phone began to ring again. This time, the figure responded. They lifted their arm. The movement was too smooth, too fluid. Like a marionette controlled by an expert puppeteer, and brought the receiver closer to their ear. I still couldn't see a phone cord, couldn't make out any of the details that would confirm this was a normal, if strange, late night phone conversation. But I could hear them speaking. The words were too distant and distorted to make out clearly, but the rhythm was wrong for normal speech. Too fast, then too slow, with pauses that lasted too long and inflections that didn't match any language I recognized. And underneath the voice, if it was a voice, I could hear something else. Something that sounded like static or wind, or the distant murmur of many voices speaking at once. I realized I was moving closer, drawn by a curiosity that overrode my growing fear. My feet carried me to the edge of the sidewalk, where only the width of the street separated me from the impossible phone booth and its motionless occupant. From this distance, I could see more details that my mind struggled to process. The figure's coat wasn't actually dark. It was the absence of color entirely, a void that seemed to pull at the light around it, and their profile, when they occasionally turned their head slightly during their strange conversation, showed features that were simultaneously too sharp and too soft, as if someone were drawing a human face from memory but couldn't quite get the proportions right. The rain continued to fall, but now I noticed that it seemed to avoid the phone booth entirely. The drops that should have been striking the glass panels and metal frame were bending around the structure, creating a perfect cylinder of dry air in the midst of the storm. My rational mind offered explanations, wind patterns, optical illusions, the way water might sheet off a properly designed surface, but I could see individual raindrops changing direction in mid-air as they approached the booth, curving away as if repelled by an invisible force. The figure finished their conversation and hung up the phone, but instead of turning to leave the booth, they simply stood there, waiting, and slowly, impossibly, they began to turn around. I should have run then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this place, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was happening in that phone booth. But I was frozen, transfixed by the gradual rotation of that dark figure as they turned to face me directly for the first time. Even across the width of the rain-slicked street, even through the distortion of water, covered glass, I could see their face clearly now, and what I saw made my mind recoil in denial and terror. It was my own face looking back at me, not a resemblance, not a similarity that could be explained by coincidence or poor lighting. It was my face, exactly as it appeared in mirrors, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow and the slightly asymmetrical smile I'd always been self-conscious about. But it was wrong somehow, as if someone had taken a photograph of me and subtly distorted it, stretched it in dimensions that didn't exist in normal space. The figure, myself, raised one hand in a slow wave. Their mouth opened in what might have been a smile, but the expression was too wide, revealing too many teeth that gleamed wetly in the pale streetlight. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven sidewalk. The books I'd been clutching scattered across the pavement, their plastic covers sliding on the wet concrete. But I couldn't look away from the phone booth, couldn't break eye contact with that impossible reflection of myself. The other me pressed their palm against the glass panel that faced the street. The surface should have fogged with their breath, should have shown the warm condensation of a living person exhaling in cold air. Instead, frost began to form around their hand, in spreading outward in delicate crystalline patterns that defied the storm's warmth. And then, clearly audible despite the distance and the rain, I heard them speak. They spoke with my voice, in words I recognized but had never said aloud. "I've been waiting for you to notice me." The phone began to ring again, but this time the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. From the booth across the street, from inside my own head, from the empty air around me. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the ringing continued, growing louder and more insistent. The figure in the booth, my doppelganger, began to gesture for me to approach. "Come closer," their movements seemed to say. Come talk to me. We have so much to discuss." But I was already running, my wet shoes slipping on the sidewalk as I fled toward home. Behind me, the ringing followed, echoing off the buildings and mingling with the sound of the storm. And underneath it all, I could hear my own voice calling after me, distorted by distance and impossibility. "Don't you want to know what I'm doing here? Don't you want to know how long I've been waiting? I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building. Didn't stop until I was safely inside, with the door locked behind me. But even then, as I stood dripping in my hallway, I could still hear the faint sound of ringing. And when I passed the mirror on my way to the bathroom, I had to look twice to make sure the reflection looking back at me was really mine. It was, of course. But for just a moment, just at the edge of perception, I could have sworn I saw the figure from the phone booth, standing behind my own reflection, still waiting, still watching, still wearing my face. The next morning, when the storm had passed and the sun was shining, I walked back to that corner. The phone booth was gone, of course. There was nothing there but an empty square of sidewalk, slightly cleaner than the surrounding concrete, as if something had been protecting it from years of weather and wear. But when I passed payphones, the few that still existed in the city, I found myself looking carefully at anyone inside them, looking to see if they turned around, looking to see if they had faces I recognized, looking to see if they were looking back at me. Story 13. The ATM on Maple Street had been giving me trouble for weeks. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies that made each transaction feel slightly off. The screen would flicker for a moment too long. The card reader would hesitate before accepting my debit card. The cash would dispense with an unusual mechanical grinding sound, as if the machine was working harder than it should. But it was the closest ATM to my apartment, and I'd grown accustomed to its quirks. Late night convenience trumped minor mechanical issues, especially when you're working 3-part, time jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night. Sometimes efficiency matters more than perfection. On that Friday evening in November, I approached the machine with my usual routine wallet out, card ready, already mentally counting the $60 I needed for weekend groceries and gas. The fluorescent light above the ATM cast its familiar harsh glow over the small alcove, creating the kind of institutional atmosphere that made every late night transaction feel vaguely illicit. I inserted my card and waited for the screen to prompt me. But instead of the usual welcome message, the display showed only a line of text that made no immediate sense. Transaction processing. Please wait for your receipt. But I hadn't entered my PIN yet, hadn't selected an amount, or chosen a transaction type. The machine was treating me as if I'd already completed a withdrawal, as if it knew exactly what I wanted, and was simply moving through the motions. Technical difficulty, I muttered, pressing the cancel button, but the screen didn't change. The text remained, accompanied by the soft mechanical humming that indicated the machine was working. I tried pressing cancel again, then the clear button, then the enter key. Nothing. The screen continued to display its message. Transaction processing. Please wait for your receipt. After 30 seconds, I heard the familiar sound of paper being fed through the receipt printer. A white slip emerged from the slot, and I pulled it free, expecting to see an error message or a transaction summary for someone else's account.
Instead, I read,
"You will die tonight." I stared at the words, printed in the same mundane font used for balance inquiries and transaction records. Below them, the ATM had included all the usual receipt information: the bank's logo, the machine location, the date and timestamp. Everything looked official and legitimate, except for that impossible, terrifying message. "This is a prank," I said aloud, though my voice sounded thin in the empty alcove. Someone hacked the machine, or there's a glitch in the software. But even as I spoke, I could feel my heart rate increasing. The rational explanations felt flimsy, inadequate to explain the ice, cold certainty that had settled in my stomach. This wasn't a prank or a glitch. This was something else entirely. The ATM screen had changed. Now it displayed a new message. "Would you like another transaction?" I should have walked away. Should have gone home. Called the bank in the morning. Reported the malfunction to whoever handled such things. Should have treated this as a technical problem rather than a prophecy. Instead, I pressed yes. The screen immediately showed transaction processing. Please wait for your receipt. Again, no PIN request, no amount selection. The machine was operating according to some internal logic I couldn't understand. Processing transactions I hadn't initiated, dispensing information I hadn't requested. The second receipt printed quickly. This one read, Lowency 47 p.m., intersection of 5th and Oak. Looked both ways. The time stamp on the receipt showed 10:23 p.m. the current time, but the message referenced 11:47 p.m., an hour and 24 minutes in the future. As if the machine was not just predicting my death, but scheduling it. My hands were shaking now. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that ATMs didn't predict the future, that slips of paper couldn't contain genuine prophecies. But the rest of me, some deeper, the more primitive part, understood that I was receiving instructions from something that knew far more about my immediate future than I did. One more, I whispered, pressing yes again before I could think better of it. The third receipt arrived faster than the others, as if the machine was eager to share its information. The blue car will not see you. The driver is texting. Impact will be instantaneous. I backed away from the ATM, the 3 receipts clutched in my trembling hand. But the machine wasn't finished with me. The screen was displaying a new message. Cash withdrawal requested. Please take your money. Bills began sliding out of the dispenser. Not the $60 I'd planned to withdraw, but hundreds of dollars. 20s, 50s, even a few hundreds. More money than I'd ever seen come out of an ATM at once. The machine was giving me a fortune, as if it understood that I wouldn't have much time to spend it. I didn't request this. I said to the empty air, I can't take this money. But the bills kept coming. The machine's display now showed withdrawal amount of 47,293 YT. This represents the total remaining balance of your life account. Life account, not bank account. Life account. I stared at the growing pile of cash, understanding dawning slowly and horribly. The machine wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't dispensing my bank balance. It was calculating the value of my remaining time and converting it to currency every minute, every second, every heartbeat I had left, transformed into legal tender. How do you know? I asked the machine. How can you possibly know? The screen flickered and new text appeared. All transactions are recorded. All debits and credits. All time spent and time remaining. We have been monitoring your account since birth. We, not it. We, who is the system? The network, the institutions that track your movements, your purchases, your patterns. We know you take this route home every Friday. We know you stop at this ATM. We know about the blue car that will run the red light at 5th and Oak at exactly 11:47 p.m. I looked at the money spilling out of the machine. Thousands of dollars, representing a lifetime of future earnings, future experiences, future possibilities. All of it meaningless if the prediction was accurate. Can I change it? I asked. If I know what's going to happen, can I avoid it? A new receipt printed. Free will is an illusion. All outcomes are predetermined by the accumulation of previous transactions. You will go to 5th and Oak because that is where you always go. You will arrive at 11:47 p.m. because that is when you always arrive. Always arrive. I've never been killed by a blue car before. Time is circular. Events repeat. You have been killed by this blue car 847 times. Each time, you visit this ATM first. Each time, you receive the same warning. Each time, you make the same choices. The money had stopped dispensing. The pile at my feet represented more wealth than I'd ever seen in person, but it felt as insubstantial as confetti. What good was money if I only had an hour to live? What good was wealth if I was trapped in some kind of temporal loop, doomed to repeat the same death endlessly? Show me, I said. Show me the other times. The screen went black for a moment, then displayed what looked like security camera footage. Black and white images of the same intersection, 5th and Oak, but from different angles, different times. In each clip, I watched myself cross the street at exactly 11:47 p.m. In each clip, a blue sedan ran the red light. In each clip, the impact was instantaneous, just as the receipt had promised. But the footage showed variations too. Sometimes I was wearing different clothes. Sometimes I approached from different directions. In one clip, I was running, as if trying to avoid my fate. In another, I walked slowly, resignedly, like a condemned man approaching the gallows. You remember, don't you? The machine asked via a new receipt. Deep down, you remember all the other times. The feeling of déjà vu. The sense that you've lived these moments before. And I did remember. Not clearly, not consciously, but with the faint recognition you get when hearing a half-forgotten song. The walk home on Friday nights. The stop at the ATM. The strange reluctance I always felt about crossing at 5th and Oak, even though it was the most direct route. Why do I keep coming back? Why don't I remember clearly enough to change things? Death erases memory, but not pattern. You retain the habits, the preferences, the roots. You forget the consequences. It's a kindness in its way. Each death feels like the first. I sat down heavily on the curb. The money scattered around me like autumn leaves. So what's the point? Why warn me if I can't change anything? Perhaps warning you is not the point. Perhaps the warning is simply part of the pattern, part of what must happen for the cycle to complete. That's horrifying. Isaac, you have lived 847 lives. You have experienced every variation of your existence, every possible choice you might make, every road you might travel. You are the most complete version of yourself that has ever existed. I looked at my watch, 11:15 p.m. 30, 2 minutes until my appointment with the blue car. I could stay here, I thought. Refuse to leave the alcove. Force the pattern to break. But even as the idea formed, I could feel the compulsion building. The need to go home. The familiar comfort of my usual route. The pull of habit and routine that was stronger than logic or self-preservation. I'm going to try, I said, standing up. I'm going to try to remember this time, to carry the knowledge forward. A final receipt printed. Good luck. See you next Friday. I left the money where it had fallen. Someone else would find it, someone who had more time to spend it. I walked home slowly, taking a longer route that avoided Fifth and Oak entirely. I went to bed that night, convinced I had broken the cycle, outsmarted the system, cheated death through careful planning and sheer stubbornness. I woke up the next morning feeling victorious. But as the day wore on, my memory of the ATM encounter began to fade. By evening, the experience felt like a half-remembered dream. By the following Friday, I had forgotten it entirely. At 10:20 p.m., I approached the ATM on Maple Street to withdraw $60 for weekend groceries and gas. The machine flickered slightly as it accepted my card, and I felt a brief moment of déjà vu before entering my PIN. Transaction processing. The screen displayed. Please wait for your receipt.